Game of Thrones. The Witcher System Chapter 41. The first command. Flipping through the long list of deaths and disappearances, Clay finally understood what the old man had meant by the scent of blood. At present, Westeros had enjoyed a rare peace for more than a decade. Though Balon Greyjoy's rebellion had disturbed that calm, it had been a contained conflict rather than a war that engulfed the realm. Yet, in the shadows, away from the gaze of lords and commoners alike, blood was still being spilled. Killings, quiet and unrelenting, continued year after year, never seen, never acknowledged, yet ever present. Clay didn't recognize a single name on the list before him. He couldn't mourn them, nor could he offer empty condolences. Yet, even without knowing them, he could feel the weight of their deaths, the cruelty of it all, the way lives had been snuffed out in the darkness, unseen and unremembered. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke. "I don't want to see any deductions in their family's compensation." "Of course not. There won't be any deductions. Nobody would dare do that to them. It's the rule, and no one breaks it." It was Snow who responded. He was a little surprised that Clay cared about this particular issue. His view of the young Lord of White Harbor shifted slightly. Clay nodded but remained silent, furrowing his brows as he organized the information about the White Sea Guard in his mind. It was difficult to compare the White Sea Guard to similar organizations, but overall, it was a vast and influential network, albeit one riddled with inefficiencies. Outside of the southernmost regions, the Bay of Crabs, the Stormlands, and Dorne, which lay beyond its reach, the White Sea Guard had branches embedded across Westeros. They gathered intelligence on matters like Lord Tully's worsening illness and frequent fainting spells, or the growing doubts among the Vale's nobility about whether Robert Arryn could truly shoulder the responsibilities of House Arryn. However, most of this intelligence, especially the reports from King's Landing, came at the cost of blood. That was not something Clay could ignore. He wasn't particularly concerned about the financial burden of compensating the families of fallen spies. He had the old man behind him, after all, and money was the least of his concerns. The real problem was that this wasn't how intelligence work should be handled. If gathering intelligence was already this labor-intensive in peacetime, Clay seriously doubted the White Sea Guard would be able to maintain its influence once war broke out, especially with every noble house fully mobilizing its own network of spies and informants. For now, he had just taken command and couldn't overhaul everything overnight. But he did have one advantage. He knew exactly which individuals were worth watching. Instead of stretching their resources thin, he could consolidate the White Sea Guard's scattered forces into a few key strongholds. Clay exhaled slowly before speaking. "Am I now allowed to exercise the authority of a commander, Ser Bartimus?" "Of course, my lord. When you wear this ring, this conference room, this tower, and the entire White Sea Guard will be at your command," Ser Bartimus replied, his tone unusually relaxed, as though shedding the role of commander had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Clay tapped his fingers against the table, thinking for a moment before issuing his first command in the conference room. "Since I am now the commander, this is my order. First, withdraw all surveillance in the north, except for Winterfell. After reorganizing, redeploy those forces to Winterfell, with two primary objectives. 1. Monitor whether Bran Stark has undergone any recent changes, any kind of changes relevant. 2. Track Lady Catelyn's movements. If she plans to head south, report it immediately. Snow, you are in charge of this. Avoid congestion of personnel and minimize exposure risks." Snow gave a slight nod, silently accepting the order. He had no reason to argue with Clay, the newly appointed commander. At the end of the day, the White Sea Guard belonged to the Manderly family, and as its young lord, Clay's commands were not to be defied. Furthermore, Snow was genuinely curious about why Clay had chosen to focus all his forces on monitoring Winterfell, specifically mentioning Bran Stark and Lady Catelyn. What kind of information was Clay hoping to gather from them? Clay, however, had already moved on. With the north settled, he shifted his attention to the overseer of Riverrun, Rivers. "Rivers, continue monitoring Lord Tully's health in Riverrun. In addition, focus your efforts on the twins. When I visit House Frey, I want a direct line of communication with you. I may need your assistance." "Understood, my lord," Rivers replied from the shadows where he stood. "The White Sea Guard will do its best to ensure your safety during your stay at the twins." Clay acknowledged the response with a nod before adding, "There's also a long-term task. I need a detailed structural layout of the area surrounding the Gate of the Twins. This is not urgent, and I want it handled with discretion. I don't want to smell too much blood on this matter. Overseer Rivers did not respond, but Clay took his silence as confirmation that he had heard him. This reckless way of operating aligned well with the North's style, but Clay had no intention of endorsing it. For the task of managing the intelligence network in the Westerlands, Clay instructed his overseer, Hill, to stop clashing with House Lannister's spies. There was no need to compete for information in their own stronghold, as doing so would be both futile and risky. Instead, he gave a far more strategic directive. I don't care how you do it. Find me leverage on at least 1 or 2 Lannister members. Control them. Preferably those who can move in and out of Castle Rock. To Clay's surprise, Hill shook his head and sighed. My lord, we have tried this before, but it didn't go well. In fact, we ended up exposing several of our agents. Lord Tywin has very strict management over those who can enter and leave the castle. Hill's words forced Clay to reconsider. The situation in the Westerlands was more complicated than he had anticipated. But it was not a matter he could afford to ignore. When war broke out, the North and the Westerlands would inevitably be enemies. And sometimes, a single piece of intelligence could decide the outcome of a war. Given the current difficulties, Clay chose not to push for immediate changes. He took a step back, instructing Hill to maintain their existing network, protect their agents, and retreat when necessary rather than risk exposure. Still, whenever the opportunity arose, Clay was determined to reinforce the White Sea Guard's presence in the Westerlands properly. There was nothing particularly urgent about the Vale, so Clay had not yet decided how to address it. As for the Crownlands, Clay's instructions were straightforward. The White Sea Guard must not become a pawn in the political struggles of King's Landing. He ordered them to focus solely on tracking the regular movements of the Master of Coin, Petter Baelish, and the Master of Whisperers, Varys. Clay himself would undoubtedly make his way to King's Landing in the future, regardless of the identity he assumed. He was eager to let the two of them experience the taste of the Axii sign. Finally, Clay assigned a special task to Ocean, the overseer of the royal domain. One name, Hall Leek. This name had led to Clay's first assassination attempt in his life. The circumstances had been hurried, leaving Clay no choice but to let him go, initially planning to use Petter to eliminate him. But now, having taken command of the White Sea Guard, Clay wanted to know if this minor member of House Leek was still alive. If he was, Clay would ensure he received a proper greeting from House Manderly. Ocean furrowed his brows. He had never heard the name Hall Leek before, though he had heard of House Leek, which was a vassal of House Riker from the town of Duskendale. Setting aside how Lord Clay had come by this name, Ocean couldn't fathom why his lord would concern himself with a man who wasn't worth the value of a single gold dragon. My lord, do not question me. Just carry out the order. I want every piece of information on him. Chapter 42 Secrets. After emerging from the walls of the Wolf's Den, Clay took a deep breath of the crisp northern air as his horse trotted forward. My lord, I really don't like them at all. These people always feel strange, said a young guard riding beside him. Clay did not mind the guard's chatter. He knew in his heart that he would probably come back to this place many more times in the future. The people of the North mostly worshipped the old gods, while House Manderly, having migrated from the Reach, adhered to the faith of the Seven. However, whether their devotion was sincere or merely for show, only they knew. House Manderly did not interfere with the beliefs of their vassals, allowing faith in both the old gods and the Seven to coexist within White Harbor. Just outside the Wolf's Den stood an ancient sacred grove, home to a heart tree that had endured for untold centuries. However, the only starfish leaf tree within the grove had shed most of its leaves, looking withered and decayed. Perhaps older than the Wolf's Den itself, this heart tree had witnessed the rise and fall of countless noble houses, their fortunes rising and fading like the tide. Clay had visited the tree before, even laid a hand against its rough, time-worn trunk. Yet to his disappointment, the magical energy it held was feeble, hardly enough to replenish his own magic pool even a little. As a descendant of the House Manderly, especially as the heir, it was not entirely fitting for Clay to visit the sacred grove that represented the faith of the old gods too often. Originally, he had no reason to enter again, but when he saw Sir Bartimus limping, using a cane as he walked into the grove, he changed his mind. Clay reined in his horse. Wait here, He told his guards before dismounting and following the old knight into the grove. The grove was not large, and Clay had rarely been here. It was always quiet here, with little to no people around. In the dense forest, Clay could only rely on his witcher senses, following Bartimus' trail on the ground. After several twists and turns, Clay finally reached the northeast corner of the grove, where the half-decayed heart tree stood. Beneath its ancient branches, Esser Bartimus rested, his weathered face turned toward the sky. When he noticed Clay's approach from a distance, Esser Bartimus cracked a slight smile, as if greeting him with a faint laugh. Esser, do you worship the old gods? Clay asked as he crossed a shallow puddle that surrounds the sacred grove, moving closer to the old knight under his watchful gaze. Yes, Esser Bartimus replied, his tone was as calm as always. I have been praying to them under this heart tree for decades. It's become a habit. There was no devotion in his tone, nor reverence, just the simple weight of truth. Clay's eyes drifted downward, landing on a black bottle partially buried in the earth near the old knight's feet. He wasn't sure what it contained, but something about it felt significant. As if sensing his gaze, Esser Bartimus leaned back against the tree, sliding down until he sat with his back against the gnarled trunk. He tossed aside his cane, then tapped a finger against the mouth of the bottle before speaking again. When I was on the battlefield, I traded one of my legs for your grandfather's life. This, he gestured toward the bottle, was the gift he gave me, along with this castle. He told me that when I retire, I should drink this bottle of wine with him. Clay was stunned. He had never expected such an ordinary-looking bottle to hold such a story. Then why? He started to ask but trailed off. Esser Bartimus waved a hand dismissively and plucked a stalk of sour grass swaying in the wind. He slipped it between his teeth, chewing slowly. As he savored the bitter taste, he answered Clay's question between bites. I did think about it once, having a drink with your grandfather and the old comrades. But unfortunately, now, the only ones left from that time are your grandfather and me. Drinking with him would make me think of them, and that's not worth it. His voice was calm, steady as still water, but Clay sensed the undercurrent of sorrow beneath his words. His grandfather, now in his 60s, and Esser Bartimus, not much younger, had the privilege of noble access to rest, nourishment, and care that prolonged their years. But for the common folk who once stood beside them, the battlefield had already claimed most, and those who survived rarely lived past 60. Come on, give it a try. May the gods bless it. And let's hope it hasn't turned to vinegar, Esser Bartimus said as he pulled a dagger from his chest pocket and stabbed it into the wooden cork of the bottle. With a soft pop, the slightly moldy cork came free, and a faint fragrance of wine drifted into the air. Clay, with his keen senses, immediately caught the scent. Despite its age, the wine had been fortunate enough to retain its original flavor. It's just ordinary barley wine. Do you drink this kind of stuff, young lord? Esser Bartimus asked, extending the bottle toward him. Clay didn't refuse. He took the time-worn bottle into his hands, feeling its rough, weathered surface. Following the old knight's example, Clay lifted the bottle and took a deep swig. As expected, the taste was unremarkable, just simple, unrefined barley wine. In truth, its quality was rather poor. But it didn't matter. He wasn't here to savor wine. The two of them continued drinking in silence for a while. As the alcohol seeped into their veins, loosening their tongues, Esser Bartimus finally spoke again. The old knight's hand absently brushed against the equally aged heart tree as he turned to Clay. Boy, I don't mind you making life better for the White Sea Guard, but remember this, never, never be too lenient. Esser Bartimus drained the last of the wine in one gulp, letting out a long breath before continuing. I know what you did in Winterfell. Good. Only those who have seen and shed blood can truly control the White Sea Guard. But remember this, though they bear the name of House Manderly, never, under any circumstances, place your trust in them, no matter the time. Esser Bartimus' gaze was sharp despite the haze of drink, his voice steady with conviction. You're a smart boy. You know what I'm saying. We can infiltrate other noble houses, but what makes you think they won't do the same to us? What's stopping someone from sending a man with a purse full of gold dragons to White Harbor, looking to buy loyalty out from under us? He let the question linger before shaking his head. The 5 men, for now, I can guarantee their loyalty, but the ones below. No guarantee. So here's a piece of advice. Whenever you get information from those beneath you, believe only half of it. He gave Clay a pointed look. That way, you'll rarely go wrong. Absorbing this invaluable advice, Clay knew that most of what the old knight had said was true. In this Game of Thrones, betrayal and deceit lurked around every corner, waiting for the unwary to stumble. Therefore, the best strategy was to trust everyone a little, but never believe anyone entirely. Their conversation soon drifted to other topics. Sir Bartimus, slightly loosened by the drink, began boasting of his exploits during the War of the Usurper. He spoke of the Northern Army's unmatched strength, the fierce battles they had fought, and how formidable both he and Clay's grandfather had been on the battlefield. In the end, the old knight rose and slowly walked away. Though his steps were unsteady, his back remained straight. His lord had only relieved him of his position as commander of the White Sea Guard. The vast lands surrounding this place were still his to rule. Clay remained for a moment, letting the stillness settle around him. He knelt by a shallow puddle, splashing cold water onto his face. The chill cut through the lingering haze of alcohol, sharpening his senses. Leaning on the old heart tree, he pushed himself up, brushing the dirt from his hands and clothes. Just as he was about to leave, a harsh raven's cry stopped him in his tracks. Looking up, he saw a large black raven perched on a low branch, its piercing yellow eyes locked onto him. There was something unnatural in its gaze, a flicker of intelligence beyond that of an ordinary bird. Clay didn't need to think. He already knew who it was. Activating his Witcher senses, he felt it immediately, the faint pulse of magic radiating from the raven. The energy was familiar, unmistakable. The three-eyed raven had arrived. Chapter 43 Blood and Fire. We meet once again, emissary of the outer god. The voice of the three-eyed raven, as dry and withered as decayed wood, echoed from the throat of the massive, pitch-black raven. Normally, a raven should not have been able to produce a human voice, but with the power of magic, anything was possible. I did not expect to see you here, Lord Three-Eyed Raven. Clay halted his steps, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his expression devoid of emotion as he addressed the uninvited guest. This time, he did not activate the Quen sign. In this form, the three-eyed raven posed no real threat to him. But he quickly realized that the three-eyed raven was not the only uninvited guest present. From within the dense forest emerged a towering figure, his hands firmly holding a wooden chest. The man's face bore a dull, vacant expression. He was large and heavy-set, with unkempt hair and the rough, rugged features typical of a northerner. From a distance, Clay's keen hearing picked up the murmured words escaping from the man's lips in a slow, repetitive chant. Hodor. Hodor. Clay exhaled slowly, recognizing the man at a glance. This was Hodor, the stable hand of Winterfell, the one who, in the original timeline, had carried Bran beyond the wall to meet the three-eyed raven. A truly pitiable soul, through and through. The three-eyed raven was watching Clay as well. Through the murky, clouded eyes of the great bird, Clay's form was perceived not as flesh and bone but as a construct woven from an intricate network of magic. A power coursed through Clay's very being, an unfamiliar force that unsettled the ancient seer. That was what the raven feared most. It was also the reason it had chosen to lower itself and agree to Clay's terms. Beings whose very forms were saturated with magic understood that the greatest threat to them was an unknown force invading their essence. Such contamination could corrode their very essence, unraveling the intricate threads of their existence beyond repair. Since you spared that child, I shall, in turn, fulfill my promise, emissary of the outer god. The three-eyed raven ruffled its feathers slightly, as if it had truly embraced its identity as a mere raven. With a wave of its wing, it signaled to Hodor, who, with his vacant expression unchanged, stepped forward, carrying the wooden chest toward Clay. As you wished, here is a dragon egg, the three-eyed raven declared. It comes from Silverwing, the great dragon that once descended upon Winterfell. I kept it with me ever since I discovered it, never imagining that one day, it would pass into your hands. P.S. Originally it was Vermex, but I did some research and found that he was not a she-dragon and had never laid eggs, so for now, this dragon egg will come from Silverwing. If there is any mention of it in the next chapters, I will smoothly change it. As the chest was opened, Clay's gaze was instantly drawn to the object nested within. Oval in shape and resting upon an elegant stand, the egg gleamed under the dim light. Its deep blue surface was marbled with golden streaks, weaving like veins of molten fire. Its shell bore intricate, scale-like textures, as if sculpted by a master artisan. The glossy surface was reminiscent of exquisite enamelwork, the kind only the finest craftsman of Mer could produce. It was large, so large that Clay, measuring with his hands, estimated that he would need both to barely hold it properly. Though he had often imagined what a dragon egg might look like, standing before this one in reality, he could not help but acknowledge the sheer magnificence of it. Perhaps, of all the creations left upon this world by the gods, this was among the most perfect. Reaching out, Clay placed his palm against the egg's surface. A chill seeped into his skin. It was cold. As he had suspected, the egg had long since turned to stone. In an age where magic had waned and dragons had vanished from the world, there was no longer anyone capable of awakening it. Rationality told him that, in his current position, this was nothing more than a burden, an artifact of perilous value. And yet, he knew, deep down, that there was no way he would let it slip from his grasp. It seems you are quite fond of my gift, emissary of the outer god. The voice of the three-eyed raven whispered in Clay's ear, pulling him from his thoughts. I must ask again, Lord Three-Eyed Raven, why are you doing this? Clay's question went straight to the heart of the matter. A fully grown dragon, if given time, could wield destructive power on par with the nuclear warheads of the world he once knew, a true weapon of mass destruction. The ancient seer was unsurprised by the inquiry. When it answered, it did so with patience, as though it had long anticipated this moment. The answer remains the same. My master and I seek only to survive. If you and your god do not claim the south, then R'hllor and his emissary will take it instead. I have told you before, should his power grow unchecked, it will bring an imbalance to this world. R'hllor's emissary. A name surfaced in Clay's mind at once. The woman who had altered the course of war itself. The Red Priestess, Melisandre. Had it been R'hllor's will that guided her to Stannis Baratheon, strengthening his claim with fire and prophecy, and that brought Jon Snow back from the dead. A sharp breath escaped Clay's lips. This bastard. The Raven had been setting him up all along. Every move had been calculated. Pushing Clay into power, maneuvering him to take the south, all so that, in the end, he and R'hllor would be forced into open conflict. This scheming old Raven. The realization darkened Clay's expression. Yet, regardless of the truth he had uncovered, he knew there was no chance he would refuse this gift. His jaw tightened as he reached out and took the wooden chest from Hodor's hands. The three-eyed raven had cast its bait, but Clay had resolved to be the fish. That took the bait without ever biting the hook. Then tell me, how does one hatch a dragon egg? He demanded. A king died in the tragedy of Summerhall. I know that conventional methods alone will not awaken this egg. Summerhall. The once glorious summer palace of House Targaryen. It was there that King Aegon V, desperate to restore his dwindling house to its former glory, had attempted to hatch 7 dragon eggs. He had surrounded them with wildfire and set the palace aflame, believing fire alone could awaken them. Whether it was a conspiracy or a miscalculation by the pyromancers, the outcome remained the same. The wildfire spiraled out of control. A king and his crown prince perished in the inferno. House Targaryen suffered an irreparable blow. And that very night, in the heart of that blazing ruin, Rhaegar Targaryen, Daenerys's older brother, was born. At the mention of this tragedy, the three-eyed raven fell momentarily silent. But only for a moment. They failed, it eventually said, not because of the fire. Not because of Targaryen blood. No, they lacked something far more crucial. Something that both you and I possess. Clay immediately understood. His eyes widened as the answer escaped his lips. Magic. The three-eyed raven inclined its head slightly, a gesture of agreement. Precisely. Magic. When the last dragon died, the magic of this world entered a period of decline. But now, to awaken a dragon, 3 conditions must be met: intense heat, special blood, and magic itself. Back when dragons still roamed, such methods were unnecessary. Dragons, born of magic, could hatch naturally. But now, this is the only way. There is no other choice. The three-eyed raven had given its answer. And as Clay processed its words, the pieces began to fall into place. No wonder. No wonder Daenerys had been able to hatch her 3 dragons. Her immunity to fire had allowed her to survive the flames. Targaryen blood, already rare and steeped in legend, had fulfilled the second condition. And through the sacrifices of the witch, her husband, and her unborn child, offerings made in a world deprived of magic, she had acquired the final piece. The magic necessary to bridge the gap. Thus, the conditions had been met. The stone-bound dragons had been awakened. After the long summer, beneath the bleeding star, the mother of dragons was born. Chapter 44 The Secret of the Bloodline. Realizing that the three-eyed raven had spoken the truth, Clay suddenly found himself pondering a question. Since he had already obtained a dragon egg and was a descendant of House Targaryen, why hadn't this former Lord Bloodraven taken to the skies on Dragonback himself? His gaze fell upon the unfortunate creature currently possessed by the three-eyed raven. Considering the current state of this enigmatic entity, Clay immediately grasped the reason behind it. It was, in essence, a matter of timing. When he was still the Lord Bloodraven, he had never come into contact with this dragon egg, nor had he possessed any magic of his own. But by the time he became a greenseer and merged with magic itself, he could no longer escape from this state. There was a certain grim irony to it. A series of unfortunate circumstances had delayed the return of dragons by an entire 100 years. High temperatures were not an issue. As long as the environment was suitable, achieving the necessary heat would be simple. At worst, he could just start a fire. After all, based on Daenerys' experience, no matter how high the temperature, a dragon egg wouldn't simply turn into a roasted egg. The problem of magic was also manageable. If necessary, he could make another trip to Winterfell, place one hand on the weirwood, and infuse the dragon egg with magic using the other. A reckless move, to be sure, but Clay had never been one to shy away from danger. The most troublesome obstacle, however, was the requirement for special blood. This condition was truly perplexing. The Targaryens could bond with dragons, as could the Velaryons of Driftmark. Even some bastards with mixed blood had successfully ridden dragons before. But what was the true nature of this bloodline? Clay did not know. However, he was certain of one thing. His ancestry traced back to House Manderly of the Andals. Their blood had no resonance with dragons. Special blood. How am I supposed to fulfill this condition? I'm not a Targaryen, and my ancestors never intermarried with them. The three-eyed raven shook his head and spoke in a calm, measured tone. No, you have misunderstood the nature of bloodlines. Of course, this is not your fault. If I had not become my lord's emissary, I too would never have known the secrets hidden within so-called bloodlines. Clay was intrigued by the mention of my lord. The powers of the three-eyed raven were not limited to subtly influencing others and controlling creatures to grant him an all-seeing vision. One of his most significant abilities was the power to look into the past and glimpse the future. From every perspective, both this entity and its master seemed to serve as chroniclers of the world's history. Standing still, Clay patiently waited for the three-eyed raven to continue speaking about the truth of bloodlines. My lord has told me that in the ancient Valyrian freehold, there were dozens of dragonlord families. Their bloodlines allowed them and their descendants to ride dragons. But have you ever wondered why ordinary Valyrians did not have dragons of their own? The truth is that those nearly 40 dragonlord families carried a bloodline distinct from that of common Valyrians. Their blood was what we call the High Valyrian bloodline. Dragons are creatures woven from magic and fire. The so-called High Valyrian bloodline is, in essence, an innate affinity for fire magic. Only those who carry this bloodline can truly bond with dragons and communicate with these beings, born of flame and sorcery. As for you, emissary of the other god, your body is beyond my understanding. Not long ago, in the courtyard of this fortress, I saw you wield fire magic. In my vision, you have also used a defensive magic of unknown composition and a type of mental magic that I have never encountered before. This overturns my understanding. Within my knowledge, different schools of magic are inherently in conflict with each other, just as ice and fire cannot coexist. And yet, you are an exception. There are times when I even wonder if the god behind you is one of the great deities who perished during the age of great sorcery, and you, their emissary, walking this world upon their return. It was a long speech, yet Clay carefully committed every word to memory. These were not merely revelations about bloodlines. They were fragments of lost history, pieces of the world's forgotten truths. His fingers unconsciously traced the hilt of his sword as he struggled to digest the influx of information. Slowly, he pieced his thoughts together. So, according to your explanation, because I can use fire magic, I should be able to communicate with dragons. Which means, like the Targaryens, I should also be able to ride a dragon. No, that is not quite the case. The three-eyed raven's response was immediate, shattering Clay's hopes. Physical constitution and ability are not the same thing. If merely wielding fire magic were enough to ride a dragon, then the High Valyrian bloodline would not be as significant as it truly is. The key is not the ability itself, but the bloodline. You can wield fire magic, but that does not necessarily mean you are attuned to its very essence. This touches upon knowledge recorded by my lord, but it is not what we are here to discuss today. As for the matter of bloodlines, I have brought you a solution. True dragon bloodlines, in this world, only a few remain. 2 young dragons across the narrow sea, one hidden among a pack of wolves, and one standing in lonely vigil atop the wall. But you have no means of reaching them. Yet you are also fortunate, for I, too, was once a bearer of the true dragon bloodline. As soon as he finished speaking, Hodor, who had been standing dumbly like a statue, wordlessly produced a small transparent glass bottle from somewhere. Through the flawlessly clear glass, Clay saw what was contained within, a dark red liquid. This is my blood. Once, it was filled with my lord's power. But now, I have reclaimed that power. Now, summon your magic. Feel the energy within this blood, just as you would when drawing magic from the heart tree. The Witcher's system activated in silence. In Clay's vision, the liquid inside the bottle was no longer blood. It was fire, burning fiercely, alive. He reached out, grasping the narrow bottle, and unleashed the full capacity of his mana absorption. At first, the fire within the glass flickered quietly. Then, as if suddenly ignited by an unseen force, it surged like a raging current, rushing into Clay's palm and coursing through his body. To the naked eye, the dark red liquid inside the bottle began to boil violently, bubbling like water at a rolling boil. Thick wisps of crimson steam rose from the bottle's mouth and were drawn into Clay's hand. Scorching hot. That was the only thing Clay could feel at this moment. It felt as though his right hand was about to turn to ash. The searing heat spreads through every inch of his palm, his arm, his muscles, his very bones. And with it came an excruciating pain, one that seemed to tear through his being. This was entirely different from the agony of a Witcher's mutation. But without a doubt, if it had been an ordinary person, they would have long since lost consciousness from the sheer intensity of the pain. As the sensation of molten fire poured into his veins, the heat spread upward with each powerful beat of his heart. Clenching his teeth, Clay barely endured it. In the midst of his suffering, the voice of the three-eyed raven echoed in his ears. This is the gift the gods bestowed upon the dragonlords. But you, emissary of the other god, as an outsider, if you wish to claim this power, you must endure far more than the heirs of the dragonlords ever did. This is the price of power. His mana surged wildly, desperately trying to counteract the burning force invading his bloodstream. But his mana reserves were nearly depleted, only 120 points remained. Who knew how long that would last? His vision flickered. The voice of the three-eyed raven echoed in his mind like a priest reciting scripture. When this blood flows through your body, completing a full cycle before returning to your heart, it will finally settle there in dormancy. You must then summon your magic and attempt to assimilate it. You are forging an entirely new Dragonlord bloodline. This is a method known only to my lord, one who has endured the long river of time. Good luck, emissary of the other god. Chapter 45. To hatch or not to hatch? That is the question. When Clay's guards sensed that something was amiss and hurried into the sacred grove, they found their young lord slumped against the heart tree, fast asleep in utter exhaustion. There was nothing unusual around him, just a wooden box lying beside a shallow pool of water. The box was empty. No matter how carefully they searched, the guards found nothing inside. The crisp sound of iron-clad boots crushing the fallen, withered leaves of the heart tree jolted Clay from his deep slumber. But, even as his consciousness returned, he had no desire to get up. He was utterly drained. The torment he had endured, the searing pain that had nearly driven him to the brink of collapse, had finally subsided. The scalding heat that once surged through his veins had settled in his heart, just as the three-eyed raven had foretold. It was no longer spreading. With the promise fulfilled, the rest was up to Clay alone. The three-eyed raven's harsh, grating voice, like the brittle snap of deadwood, echoed through the ancient forest. Then, With a powerful flap of its wings, the spectral bird vanished into the misty darkness. Hodor's towering figure also faded into the dense undergrowth, leaving Clay alone in the sacred grove. Overwhelmed by drowsiness, Clay barely had the strength to resist before sleep overtook him. But before he succumbed entirely to exhaustion, he tucked the dragon egg into his Witcher's system inventory, the same way he stored ingredients for his herbal concoctions. Lord Clay, are you all right? The guards rushed to his side, their voices laced with concern. Inwardly, they sighed in frustration. Their young lord was kind and noble, courageous beyond words, but his habit of wandering off alone was enough to give them endless headaches. Rumor had it that this wasn't the first time. The previous captain of his escort, Hoster, had been demoted to the smithy to forge weapons, all because he had failed to keep track of Clay during their journey to Winterfell. I'm fine. Clay waved a hand dismissively. In the brief moment it took for him to fully wake up, he had already come up with an excuse. I had a few drinks with Ser Bartimus. That wine of his packs quite the punch. I must have dozed off here. The guards subtly sniffed the air, and sure enough, a faint scent of alcohol clung to their young lord's clothes. His explanation seemed plausible enough. As long as he was unharmed, there was no need to seek confirmation from Ser Bartimus. Whether his words were true or not was irrelevant. It was not their place to question a noble's affairs. Two of the sturdier guards stepped forward, hoisting their supposedly intoxicated lord onto his horse. They positioned themselves on either side, ensuring he wouldn't fall. Slumped in the saddle, Clay sighed inwardly. It seemed he had no choice but to keep up the act of a drunken fool until they reached the castle. And so, with a weary and unsteady sway, the young lord of White Harbor, burdened by overwhelming fatigue, returned to Newcastle under the watchful escort of his men. When they arrived, Clay was handed over to his sister, Winifred. The captain of the guard let out a relieved sigh, but after a moment of hesitation, he turned and made his way toward the Sea God's Tower, where Lord Wyman resided. Seated by the fireplace, Lord Wyman listened intently as the captain reported the incident. Upon hearing that Clay had passed out drunk, his brows lifted in mild surprise. In his memory, his grandson had inherited his own remarkable tolerance for alcohol. It was rare for Clay to drink to the point of collapse. At first, Wyman found the thought amusing. But when he learned that Clay's supposed drinking partner had been Ser Bartimus, his expression froze for the briefest moment. Then, as if struck by sudden realization, his face contorted into an odd mix of shock and outrage. That old bastard. He had promised to share that bottle of wine with him. How could he have gone and drunk it with his grandson instead? Did he have no regard for their brotherhood? Before the bewildered guard captain, Wyman's expression shifted several times. Confusion, irritation, betrayal. Before he waved his hand impatiently, dismissing the man. As soon as the door closed, the unmistakable sound of objects crashing against the walls echoed from within the room. Standing outside, the captain was left utterly baffled. What in the seven hells had just happened? The next day by the time Clay woke up, it was already noon. His last memory before falling unconscious was leaning against his sister Winifred's shoulder as she brought him into his chambers. Now, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, he muttered, "If I ever trust that old raven again, I'll." He paused mid-sentence. No, best not to curse himself. After all, he had been the one to ask the three-eyed raven for the dragon egg. In the end, he had no one to blame but himself. Leaning back against the plush, cushion-stuffed headboard, Clay could still feel a faint heat radiating from his chest. He knew exactly what it was. The blood of the Dragonlord now resided in his heart. And now, he had to find a way to deal with it. Checking his mana pool, he found that he had spent 40 points of mana alleviating the pain yesterday. That left him with 80 points remaining. Gathering his energy, he directed his magic toward the Dragonlord's blood nestled within his heart. The moment his Witcher-infused blood surged forward, surrounding the foreign presence within him, the two forces collided. A sharp, stabbing pain shot through his chest. It felt as though 1,000 needles were piercing straight into his heart. Clay gritted his teeth, exhaling sharply. His face paled from the agony, but after a few moments, the pain subsided. Cursing under his breath, he braced himself and focused once more. This time, he noticed something. His own mana-infused blood had absorbed the faintest trace of heat from the Dragonlord's blood. There was potential here. If he repeated the process, bombarding the Dragonlord's blood with his own Witcher-infused blood until they fully merged. He could forge a new Dragonlord bloodline within himself. However, judging by the searing pain he had just experienced, if he recklessly poured all his mana into the process at once, he might very well suffer cardiac arrest and drop dead on the spot. So, slow and steady it would have to be. Clay let out a long sigh. There was an old saying, better a short pain than a long one. Unfortunately for him, he had no choice but to endure the long, drawn-out agony instead. For now, he set aside the issue of the Dragonlord's blood. There was another, far more pressing matter to consider. Now that he had the dragon egg, what was he going to do with it? Before, he had only entertained idle fantasies about what he would do if he ever got his hands on a dragon. But now, with that possibility before him, he had to weigh his options carefully. Raising a direwolf was one thing. It was a symbol of his northern heritage, a badge of noble blood. But raising a dragon, that was another matter entirely. In the north, direwolves were revered. A dragon, however, would be seen as the remnant of a bygone era, an echo of the old Targaryen dynasty that had been overthrown. If word got out that he possessed one, he would be hunted down like a traitor. If he were just some nameless noble of a minor house, he might have taken the egg and fled without hesitation. But he wasn't. He was the rightful heir to House Manderly, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the north, recognized across all of Westeros. This complicated matters. From a logical standpoint, there was no way he could simply abandon his title, his wealth, and his family for a single dragon. And from an emotional standpoint, he couldn't even bring himself to betray Winifred, Willa, or his grandfather. But regardless of what he chose, he needed a backup plan. Across the narrow sea, a vengeful queen would one day return to Westeros, leading an army and riding atop 3 dragons. And when that time came, perhaps his dragon could change the course of history in ways no one could yet predict. Because when that moment arrived, there would be only one true Dragonlord left in the world. Daenerys Targaryen. Or maybe, Clay would be, too. Chapter 46 Departure 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. That morning, a squad of House Manderly's finest armored cavalry gathered in the courtyard of New Castle. Their mission was to escort the young Lord of White Harbor on his journey south to the Twins. Above them, more than a dozen banners bearing the blue merman sigil fluttered in the wind, their rippling shadows dancing across the assembled soldiers. As the morning sun casts its golden light upon their cloaks, the great gates of New Castle rumbled open. Clad in full armor, Clay sat astride his steed, his breastplate gleaming with the golden trident of House Manderly. A longsword rested securely in its sheath, strapped to his saddle. With a firm grip on the reins, he guided his horse forward at a steady pace, his gaze sweeping over the ranks of his escort. Each time Clay looked upon these knights, a sense of pride swelled in his chest. Encased in heavy plates, their visors down, lances poised at the ready, these men were the undisputed rulers of the battlefield, and the Manderly family had no shortage of such warriors. This time, 200 elite knights would accompany him on the journey south. More than a mere escort, their presence served as a display of strength, a silent yet unmistakable message to House Frey. Just as he was about to set off, a slender hand reached out, gently grasping his reins. Clay turned his gaze downward and found his sister, Winifred Manderly, standing beside him in an elegant yet simple white gown. "Remember your promise, Clay," she murmured softly, her delicate fingers brushing lightly through the mane of his steed. Clay met her eyes and gave a small nod. He knew exactly what Winifred was referring to. House Frey, one of the largest families in Westeros, was relentless in their pursuit of advantageous marriages. "Don't worry, sister. If any Frey dares to suggest such a thing, I will refuse them on your behalf," he reassured her with a firm, steady voice. In truth, their grandfather had never uttered a word about arranging a match with them, which in itself was a clear message. Lord Manderly had no intention of tying his family to the Freys of the Twins. "Enough of that. It's time for me to go. Farewell, Winifred." A trace of relief flickered across her face, but it lasted only a moment. She nodded, stepping back as he straightened in his saddle. With a gentle nudge of his heels, Clay urged his horse forward, leading his knights toward the harbor. Their journey would take them by sea, sailing south until they reached a small, modest port in the Riverlands, one of the closest landing points to the Twins. Though simple and unassuming, The port was sufficient to accommodate his 200 men and their steeds. As he rode through the streets of White Harbor once more, Clay could feel the weight of countless admiring gazes upon him. The people of the city revered him. News of his confrontation in Winterfell, the tale of how he had slain a Lannister knight in defense of his family's honor, had already spread far and wide, carried from tavern to tavern by the songs of traveling bards. And beyond that, he was their young lord, the heir of White Harbor. His prestige had soared in recent days, nearly to the point where he could walk into any establishment and have his meal paid for by an eager citizen. Upon reaching the outer walls, Clay and his escort of 200 knights rode toward a military harbor, a section of White Harbor's docks reserved exclusively for House Manderly's fleet. Unlike the bustling merchant piers, this place was tightly controlled, its entry and exit governed by strict regulations. Even Clay, with the merman banner flying proudly behind him, had to present his credentials before being granted passage. For over 100 years, the North had been without a proper navy. Ever since King Brandon the Burner set aflame and destroyed the last remnants of the fleet built by his ancestor, Brandon the Shipwright, the northern seas had remained largely undefended. House Manderly, however, was an exception. Though their fleet was nowhere near the size of the Royal Navy or the Ironborn's feared longships, the immense wealth of White Harbor had allowed them to maintain a respectable number of warships. Standing on the dock, Clay counted 24 ships in total, ranging from large, heavily built sailing vessels to swift and maneuverable longships. A burly man, barefoot and clad in a coarse tunic stiffened by salt and sea spray, stood waiting at the harbor. A few other sailors stood behind him. As soon as Clay and his men approached, one of his escorts stepped forward. "Young lord, this here is the captain who will be taking you on this voyage," the knight informed him. "We will be sailing aboard the Old Man of the Sea of White Harbor to the Twins." Clay could not help but inwardly critique the uninspired naming conventions of House Manderly's ships but said nothing. Instead, he merely nodded, shifting his focus to the captain. He paid no mind to the man's rough and unkempt appearance. He knew full well that, once at sea, he would likely be far less capable than these hardened sailors. The Old Man of the Sea of White Harbor was a formidable sight. A large sailing ship, built for naval combat, its thick hull and reinforced deck spoke of its purpose, to engage enemy vessels and assert dominion over the waters. Unlike the sleek raiders of the Ironborn or the merchant cogs that filled White Harbor's bustling docks, this was a true warship. The captain stepped forward with a broad grin, his weathered face creased with deep lines. "Lord Clay, I am Captain Stawn of the Old Man of the Sea of White Harbor," he introduced himself. "I promise you a smooth and comfortable journey." Clay acknowledged him with a slight nod, exchanging brief pleasantries before following him toward the massive ship. Their horses would be transported separately, loaded onto a second, smaller vessel, where specialized caretakers would see to their needs. As Clay watched Captain Stawn stride confidently up the narrow, swaying gangplank connecting the dock to the ship, he took a deep breath. Then, under the watchful gaze of his knights, he became the first to step forward. The moment his boot touched the wooden plank, a sudden, powerful rocking sensation overtook him. The movement was intense, unsteady. Even the unnatural resilience granted by the trial of the grasses could not help him now. His legs wobbled against his will. But retreat was not an option. Gritting his teeth, Clay reminded himself that he was an excellent swimmer. Even if he lost his footing, he would not drown. At worst, he would suffer a moment of embarrassment. And that was still preferable to showing hesitation in front of his men. Mustering all his willpower, he forced his legs to obey, carefully adjusting his balance with each step. What should have taken no more than 10 seconds felt like an eternity. At last, his boots met the solid surface of the deck, and he exhaled in quiet relief. Captain Stawn, who had been watching the entire time, flashed a grin, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Young lord, you're better than most of the green boys I've seen. For someone who hasn't spent much time on a ship, you crossed that plank steadier than most." Clay maintained his noble composure, merely inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, his legs still trembled. Faintly. Behind him, the knights began boarding. The captain of his escort strode forward without hesitation, crossing the plank in a mere few steps, his heavy boots thudding against the wood in quick succession. Most of the guards were seasoned veterans, well accustomed to the sea. Aside from a handful of younger men who faltered slightly, the 150 warriors boarded with ease. The remaining 50, tasked with overseeing the safe transport of the warhorses, would travel aboard the second vessel. Once on board, Clay took note of something peculiar. The first thing his knights did was remove their heavy plate armor, stripping down to lighter chainmail for protection. Frowning slightly, he turned to his captain of the guard and asked, "Why the rush to remove armor? The Bay of Bight is still home to many pirates, is it not?" "Pirates?" The man shook his head, leaning in slightly as he lowered his voice. "Young lord, when you're aboard a ship, shedding unnecessary weight is crucial. The ocean is unpredictable. If the waves grow rough, the constant motion will drain a man's strength in no time if he's wearing heavy plate armor." His gaze flickered to Clay's own armor before he reached out, unfastening the straps without hesitation. "You've not been on many voyages, my lord, so it's understandable. But trust me, this armor will be of no use to you aboard this ship. This isn't 10 years ago. The pirates of the Bight wouldn't dare challenge White Harbor's fleet now." Seeing his captain's confidence, Clay saw no reason to argue. He allowed the man to help him remove the armor, knowing he was surrounded by loyal guards. His only real concern was the unlikely event of a shipwreck, and if that happened, a suit of plates would be the last thing he wanted weighing him down. Stepping into the cabin prepared for him, Clay leaned back, letting the gentle sway of the old man of the Sea of White Harbor lull him into the steady rhythm of the sea. Chapter 47 Naval Power. Once the initial sense of unfamiliarity faded, boredom set in from the unchanging seascape, and dizziness crept up from the constant rocking of the waves. Both sensations descended upon Clay at the same time. Though he had already experienced seasickness on the voyage back to Westeros, the discomfort still clung to him now, relentless and unwelcome. The once spacious cabin now felt stiflingly small, its wooden walls seeming to close in on him, threatening to suffocate. Suppressing the nausea rising in his throat, Clay pushed open the heavy cabin door and stepped outside, hoping that the howling sea breeze would help clear his head. The moment he emerged, the sharp evening chill of the Bight's waters bit into his skin, making him involuntarily shiver. A sharp-eyed guard stationed nearby took notice and quickly draped a thick cloak over his shoulders. Clay nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze sweeping over the tranquil deck before he asked, "Where is Captain Ston?" The guard, clad in light clothing yet seemingly unaffected by the cold due to his constant movements, pointed toward the wooden platform at the ship's stern. "Captain Ston is up there, my lord. Do you need me to escort you?" The guard asked out of concern, noticing how unsteady Clay appeared. Waving a hand dismissively, Clay refused the offer. Though he still felt unwell, the mutations his body had undergone as a witcher ensured that his discomfort would never surpass a certain limit, one he could still endure. Stepping onto the wooden stairs, he climbed the wooden stairs leading up to the stern platform, where he soon spotted both the captain and the leader of the guards. The last traces of the crimson sunset were fading beneath the western horizon of the Bight, leaving only the rhythmic crash of waves against the hull, their sound layered like the whisper of an endless tide. At the sound of his approach, Captain Ston and the guard captain turned their heads. It was clear they had been deep in discussion moments before, but upon seeing Clay, the guard captain immediately stepped forward to greet him. "My lord, what brings you up here?" Seasickness was already an issue, and his body was naturally more susceptible to illness. If he caught cold from prolonged exposure to the sea wind, it would be troublesome, especially on a ship where medicine was scarce. The guard captain couldn't help but worry. However, his concerns were entirely unnecessary. The Witcher's body, altered through mutations, was resistant to most diseases. There was no way he would fall ill simply from the sea wind. "It's nothing," Clay replied, brushing off the concern. "The cabin was too stuffy. I needed some fresh air." He wasn't in the mood for unnecessary pleasantries and swiftly changed the subject. "What were the two of you discussing just now? May I listen in?" Though his words carried a tone of politeness, Clay was, without question, the highest authority aboard this ship. No one here had the right to refuse him. "Of course, my lord," Captain Ston replied, a rugged smile forming on his lips before sharing their conversation. "We were talking about this very ship beneath our feet. My lord, are you familiar with White Harbor's fleet?" At this, Clay had no choice but to admit his ignorance. Since his return to Westeros, he had been occupied with various matters, leaving him little time to familiarize himself with his house's affairs. He had a vague notion that White Harbor possessed a fleet, but he had no clear idea of its exact size or composition. Seeing the young lord shake his head, Captain Ston patiently provided an explanation. My lord, our White Harbor fleet was built entirely under the command of Lord Manderly. Currently, we have 10 large sailing ships, 12 longships, and 2 oared galleys. How does our fleet rank compared to the rest of Westeros? Clay inquired. That's difficult to say, Ston admitted, stroking his chin in thought. But at the very least, Lord Stannis' royal fleet could crush ours with ease. They have 3 times as many warships as we do. And House Lannister and House Tyrell both command fleets of similar size to ours. Clay nodded. This matched his expectations. However, a sudden thought made him pause. He quickly realized that Captain Ston had left out one key player. What about the Iron Islands? To his surprise, Ston simply shrugged, spreading his hands with a look of helplessness. Them. Even if you combined all the fleets I just mentioned, their total strength would be roughly equal to that of the Ironborn. Those sea devils know nothing else but shipbuilding. Give them enough time, and they could easily produce 200 more warships. Clay knew that the Iron Fleet was considered the most formidable navy in Westeros, but he had not expected the disparity to be this vast. In naval warfare, barring any external factors, sheer numbers at this stage of technology usually determine the victor. Moreover, our sailors aren't nearly as skilled as the Ironborn, Ston added, a trace of admiration in his voice. That's just the way it is. Their lands have little farmland to sustain them, so they spend months at a time eating and sleeping aboard their ships. For them, it's more than just a livelihood, it's their way of life. There was no argument against that. It was the same reason Westerosi knights could never rival the Dothraki in horsemanship. It wasn't a fair comparison. The ambitious vision Clay had just begun to harbor, of dominating the narrow sea, was immediately doused. Still, he was unwilling to let go of the thought entirely, so he pressed further. If the Iron Fleet is so powerful, how did King Robert manage to put down Balon Greyjoy's rebellion? Ha! That's another story altogether, Captain Ston chuckled. You've heard of Lord Stannis, the commander of the Royal Fleet, haven't you? The Battle of Fair Isle, where the Iron Fleet was nearly wiped out, was his doing. There's a saying. If Lord Stannis hadn't destroyed the Iron Fleet, King Robert's army would have been left stranded on the shores, unable to do a thing. Forget breaching Pike's walls, he wouldn't even have made landfall. Clearly animated by the topic, Captain Ston eagerly recounted the battle's events to Clay. In simple terms, Lord Stannis had used a decoy to lure the Iron Fleet into the narrow waters between Fair Isle and the mainland. Once they had entered, using the terrain to his advantage, the royal fleet sealed off both ends of the passage, trapping the Ironborn in a deadly encirclement. After a brutal battle, only a handful of Ironborn ships managed to break through and escape. The rest were sent to the ocean floor by Stannis' relentless assault. With the Iron Fleet decimated, the Baratheon royal family seized absolute control over Westeros' seas. From that point forward, Robert could wage war however he pleased. He could also land his forces anywhere on the Iron Islands, at any time. It was likely that even Captain Ston himself hadn't realized just how crucial naval supremacy had been in determining the course of history. Take the North, for instance. The marshlands of the Neck were indeed an impenetrable natural defense, but only against conventional land warfare. For a navy, such terrain was meaningless. If the marshes of the Neck were impassable, they could simply sail around them. How did Theon Greyjoy take Winterfell? He didn't march his forces up through the Neck. He landed on the North's poorly defended western coastline and struck when the city was at its weakest. If even an inland city like Winterfell could be vulnerable, what about White Harbor, a port city sitting directly on the sea? Should war ever break out, House Manderly would have no choice but to station a sizable garrison in the city. Without naval superiority, failing to do so would be tantamount to handing White Harbor to the enemy. After all, a significant portion of the Manderly family's strength stemmed from the vast wealth the city generated. Clay's thoughts turned inward. It seemed clear that, in the future, he would have to advise his grandfather to invest heavily in strengthening the fleet. Sigh, he really was quite the spendthrift. Chapter 48 King's Landing. As Clay sailed southward through the biting winds and churning waves aboard the Old Man of the Sea from White Harbor, he entered the mouth of the White Knife, making his way into the vast, tumultuous waters of the Bight. Far to the south, in the heart of King's Landing, Eddard Stark, the newly appointed Hand of the King and Lord of the North, found himself entangled in a dire predicament, one that gnawed at his very core. Seated on a wooden platform within the largest tent of the royal encampment, he observed the chaos unfolding around him. King Robert Baratheon was bellowing orders, his voice booming over the din of armored men and bustling attendants. Yet, amidst the deafening clamor, Eddard's expression remained cold and impassive, as if he could freeze the very air around him. This tournament, held in his name, had drained nearly 100,000 gold dragons, a staggering sum, even for a realm as vast as the Seven Kingdoms. Though not enough to break the monarchy under normal circumstances, the true crisis lay elsewhere. The royal treasury was empty. Not only had the treasury been depleted, but the crown also owed over 2 million gold dragons in external debts. These included the money borrowed from Braavos Iron Bank and the substantial sum owed to Tywin Lannister, the Lord of the Westerlands, amounting to hundreds of thousands of gold dragons. Even the funds for this very tournament, including the prizes, had been borrowed from Tywin Lannister, Robert's father-in-law. Upon hearing this, Eddard Stark had nearly wished he could halt the tournament on the spot. But there was nothing he could do. This was a tournament held in his honor by Robert himself, his former brother-in-arms, his king. Even if he wished to stop it, he could not. Beyond the tent, within the arena, two knights clad in heavy armor thundered toward each other on horseback. Their lances met with a loud crack, splintering on impact, the specially treated lances designed to break easily under force. They shattered spectacularly, sending shards flying into the air. These lances were not only prone to breaking but were also costly to produce. Watching as two attendants hurried to replace the shattered lances, Eddard's heart seemed to bleed with each passing moment. With no money in the treasury, how was he, the hand of the king, supposed to govern the realm? The daily expenses of the royal household, the salaries of knights and officials, the maintenance of the royal fleet, everything demanded a steady flow of gold dragons. But where was he supposed to find the funds? He had no intention of stooping to beg the old lion, Tywin Lannister, for more. At times, Eddard found himself admiring the current master of coin, Petyr Baelish. To have kept the realm running for so many years, despite the mounting deficits, was no small feat. Perhaps Baelish was more capable than he had initially thought. Yet, Eddard was no fool. He knew that Tywin Lannister's generosity came at a price. The Iron Throne was deeply in debt to House Lannister, and while Tywin had made no immediate demands for repayment, he had, in exchange, allowed his influence to seep into the heart of the Red Keep, securing powerful positions for his family within the court. And Robert, even after being repeatedly reminded of this by the late Jon Arryn, Eddard's predecessor as Hand, still refused to heed the warnings. From the moment Eddard arrived in King's Landing, it did not take him long to realize that the scent of lions within the Red Keep far outweighed that of stags. Initially, he had no intention of participating in this pointless spectacle of jousting. To him, true martial prowess was honed on the battlefield, not in staged tournaments designed for the amusement of the nobility. What purpose did this mock combat serve, other than to draw shrill screams from the ladies in the audience and line the pockets of armorers and bookkeepers? Yet, his daughter was among the spectators. And as he thought of his late sister, Lyanna, Eddard's disdain for the tournament deepened. Even so, it was enough to make him set aside his work and attend the event in person. Robert had informed him that his son, Prince Joffrey, was betrothed to Sansa. But as Eddard watched the matches unfold, something unexpected occurred. When Loras Tyrell, the so-called Knight of Flowers, presented a single red rose to Sansa, Eddard's breath caught in his throat for a moment. His expression darkened, but then he hesitated. He recalled that Loras had no betrothal of his own, nor were the Tyrells particularly close to his family. It was merely a gesture. Even so, he remained wary. Eddard studied the young knight carefully. His armor gleamed brilliantly in the sunlight, and his movements carried an easy confidence. But Eddard, a seasoned warrior, could see past the polished exterior. Loras was an image carefully cultivated, a knight in name, but perhaps lacking true substance. Then, the announcer declared Loras's next opponent, and Eddard's lips pressed into a thin line. Gregor Clegane. The Mountain. He mused silently to himself. This arrogant Tyrell will soon get a taste of the Lannister hound's bite. Straightening in his seat, Eddard turned his full attention to the arena below. The two combatants positioned themselves at opposite ends of the list, a mere 200 paces apart. It was a safe distance. too short for either knight to build enough momentum to cause truly devastating injury. Eddard's gaze shifted to Gregor Clegane, an imposing figure astride his massive warhorse. The sheer weight of his presence made the ground seem heavier beneath him. By comparison, Loras looked almost fragile. Eddard could already foresee the outcome. After the first charge, the Knight of Flowers would be unhorsed. As the knights prepared to charge, their steeds picked up speed, but the distance was too short for them to reach a full gallop, no matter their rider's skill. The two knights closed the gap swiftly, but to Eddard's surprise, something went wrong with the mountain's horse. It seemed to disregard Gregor's commands entirely. The collision was imminent. Loras, his lance poised, aimed for a precise strike. Gregor adjusted his stance, ready to absorb the blow, but at the last moment, his horse veered wildly, throwing off his balance. A split second later, the mountain crashed to the ground with a thunderous impact, his steed collapsing beneath him. A heavy silence followed. Then gasps of shock rippled through the audience. Eddard frowned. Though he had little love for Gregor Clegane, the Lannister dog whose atrocities were infamous, he could not help but feel a flicker of disappointment. Gregor was infamous for his brutality. It was whispered that he had raped and murdered Elia Martell and butchered her children during the sack of King's Landing. He was a man without honor, a beast in human form. Yet the mountain had the unwavering support of Tywin Lannister. And despite being Hand of the King, Eddard knew he wielded little power against the Warden of the West. Still, he took quiet satisfaction in seeing Gregor humbled. Loras basked in the attention, raising his decorated sword to the crowd as noblewomen cheered his victory. But the celebration did not last long. The mountain rose to his feet, his breaths heavy, his entire body radiating fury. Without a word, he stormed toward an attendant and ripped a sword from the man's grasp. Then, with a blood-curdling roar, Gregor swung his blade down onto the neck of his own warhorse, the very beast that had failed him. The sound of steel biting into flesh rang across the field. With a sickening crack, the blade cleaved through muscle and bone. Blood spurted from severed arteries, darkening the dirt beneath. The horse gave a final shudder before collapsing lifelessly. A stunned silence fell over the audience. The once celebratory mood had vanished, replaced by unease as crimson splattered across the arena floor. Eddard grimaced, not at the blood. That did not disturb him. But since his arrival in King's Landing, the city had done nothing but reveal its cruelty and chaos in ever more grotesque ways. His thoughts turned, unbidden, to Jon Arryn. The man had died whispering a single phrase, over and over, a phrase that now echoed in Eddard's mind: the seed is strong. He did not yet understand its meaning, but he knew it had mattered to Jon. Perhaps more than anything else in his final days. The pungent stench of blood filled his nostrils, unsettling him in a way few things did. King's Landing is full of surprises, he thought. And none of them are pleasant. Chapter 49. The twins. The stench of blood from King's Landing could not possibly drift to the tranquil riverlands. As he stepped onto the heavily weathered boulder at the shoreline, Clay took a deep breath, feeling the earth beneath his feet. Behind him, the White Harbor Guard was completing their disembarkation in an orderly fashion. Dressed in a set of lighter yet highly protective armor, the captain of the guard walked steadily across the mix of sand and soil, leaving deep footprints as he approached his young lord. They had now entered the Riverlands, which meant they had officially stepped into the south. The distance from the north was not great, yet the climate had shifted drastically. Here, Clay could not feel the familiar chill of White Harbor at all. Instead, sweat had already begun trickling down his back. This place was far too hot compared to home. Young lord, we should be able to depart in about an hour. Despite the Riverlands being densely populated, this rugged, rocky coastline was eerily devoid of any human presence. Clay and his men had brought ample provisions, but no matter what, it would be best to find civilization as soon as possible. The captain of the guard had traveled this route before, yet it had already been a year since his last journey from White Harbor to the Twins. The small, dilapidated dock remained unchanged, but the narrow path leading inland had mysteriously vanished. It took a good amount of time for the first group of soldiers ashore to comb through the dense overgrowth before they managed to uncover the faint traces of the old trail. This was strange. The dock did not appear to have been left unattended for an entire year. After all, most ships departing from White Harbor for the Riverlands docked here. Did someone maintain it themselves? The captain of the guard had no answers. After making a brief report to Clay, he stood silently to the side, awaiting his young lord's command. Before departure, the old lord had given explicit instructions. On this journey, no matter the situation, Clay must be the one to issue all orders. The experienced captain could offer his opinions, but only after Clay had made his decision. By now, Captain Ston and his grand vessel, Old Man of the Sea of White Harbor, had long vanished beyond the horizon. As per their arrangement, once Clay departed from the twins, he would dispatch a raven to White Harbor. Upon receiving the message, Captain Ston would return with the fleet to this very location. Glancing at the darkening sky above and the dense forest ahead, Clay made his decision. We make camp here, light the fires, prepare the food, and set up night patrols. This is not our land. We must remain vigilant. The captain of the guard had initially considered heading to a small village that he recalled being nearby. After all, sleeping under a roof would be far preferable. However, seeing how the path had been completely swallowed by wild grass, he was uncertain whether the village even existed anymore. With that in mind, he saw no need to oppose his young lord's decision. Besides, even with Lord Wyman's authorization, he would not dare openly defy Clay. Once the order was given, the 200 well-trained soldiers swiftly began chopping wood and preparing the camp. It seemed they had anticipated such a situation, as they had already brought along some 50 men equipped with tools specifically for setting up camp. Clay walked among his men, sword at his hip, occasionally engaging in brief conversations with those taking a break. The discussions were mostly trivial and unimportant, but the effect was clear. The soldiers seemed far more at ease than before. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon once again, the soldiers had erected a simple but well-fortified encampment. The horses were secured within a wooden enclosure, and numerous sentries were stationed throughout the perimeter. Beyond the camp's defenses, 2 teams of 10 seasoned hunters ventured into the woods, fully armed. Their primary task was to drive away any lurking beasts and ensure the camp remained undisturbed through the night. Of course, if they happened to catch some game, these hunters would certainly not refuse the chance for a more lavish dinner. At dawn the next day, under the guidance of the captain of the guard, Clay led his 200 cavalrymen into the forest. Calling it a forest was not entirely accurate. It was more akin to an expanse of towering thickets, tangled and unyielding. The lead captain rode ahead, carefully scouting for a suitable path, ensuring the dense vegetation would not hinder their advance or injure the horses as they passed through. It took them the better part of the day to navigate through the undergrowth. But finally, Clay saw it, the King's Road, the great highway that linked the north and the south. The mere sight of it reassured him that they were heading in the right direction. They could press onward. 3 days later, near the banks of the Green Fork, Clay and his men finally encountered a patrol from House Frey. A lone sentry stood watch, his posture stiffening the moment 200 fully armed cavalrymen emerged before him. His face paled, and his hand instinctively flew to his sword. Had he not spotted the dozen or so merman banners fluttering among the White Harbor troops, he might have already turned and fled in terror. Greetings, soldier of House Frey, the captain of the guard addressed him firmly. We are forces of White Harbor, escorting our young lord, Lord Clay, to the twins for an audience with Lord Walder Frey. He deliberately emphasized the title Lord. After all, the Freys had no shortage of men named Walder, and he had no desire for unnecessary complications due to a misunderstanding. Judging by the soldiers' reaction, it seemed House Frey had already been informed of Clay's arrival. Moreover, it appeared they were quite eager to receive him, as the soldier immediately adopted an attitude of extreme deference. My lord, I shall escort you to the twins, he said, bowing toward the assembled riders. Not knowing who Clay was, he refrained from directly addressing anyone in the group. Until Clay chose to reveal himself, it was not his place to ask. Clay merely nodded, feeling a subtle sense of relief. The latter half of this journey had felt more like a wilderness expedition than a diplomatic mission. The only signs of civilization they had encountered were the occasional travelers along the King's Road. As they advanced, Clay considered his next move, then turned to his captain of the guard, who was riding nearby. Go and speak with him. Try to gather some insight into the situation within House Frey. I also need to know exactly who we'll be meeting first. When stepping into the twins, the first move must be made with utmost caution. The captain pondered Clay's words for a moment before grasping his intent. House Frey was notoriously fragmented into numerous factions. Though not a noble himself, the captain did not view matters purely from a noble's perspective. For Clay, this visit had a clear objective: he must meet directly with Lord Walder Frey himself. As for the other Freys, he would deal with them after making contact with the White Sea Guard agents stationed within the fortress. Meeting the wrong person first could easily entangle him in unwanted complications, and Clay had no patience for such distractions. Before departing White Harbor, the White Sea Guard's Riverlands administrator had informed him that all available personnel in the region had already been deployed to the Twins. Someone would make contact with him upon his arrival. Following the Frey soldier's lead, Clay finally glimpsed the Green Fork. He saw the bridge. He saw the twin towers rising on either bank, their banners, countless and unyielding, fluttering in the wind. This was the Twins. At first sight, only one thought surfaced in Clay's mind. If I were leading an army, how would I take this place? Thus, the Frey plotline begins. This fortress is the bottleneck that holds the north in check, the gate that dictates the march south. Clay has not come here for sightseeing. The Twins is a place where schemes are meant to unfold. Chapter 50. There are quite a few Freys here as expected. Just as Clay had predicted, the sentry leading them toward the Twins belonged to one of the factions of House Frey. According to the captain of his guard, who had galloped back to Clay's side to report, had Clay not inquired, they would have been taken straight to Ser Aenys Frey. Based on the intelligence reports on House Frey that Clay had read in White Harbor, this Aenys Frey was the third son of Walder Frey, the current lord of the Twins. Following Clay's instructions, the captain of the guard remained by the sentry's side. As they advanced further and fully entered the line of sight of the Twins' watchtowers, a deep, resonant horn echoed across both banks of the Green Fork. Cavalry approaching. Although the gates were not shut immediately, Clay's keen eyesight caught sight of the commotion at the entrance. Peasants and merchants who had been making their way into the city suddenly bolted toward the gates as if fleeing for their lives. Clearly, the unexpected appearance of the cavalry had struck terror into them. As the aged and cunning patriarch who had ruled House Frey with an iron grip for decades, Walder Frey learned of Clay's arrival the moment the cavalry was spotted. At that very moment, Walder was rambling on while holding the hand of yet another great-granddaughter. He had long since lost count of how many he had. But as soon as he heard that the banners of House Manderly had appeared outside the gates, he immediately knew who had come. Releasing the young girl's hand, which he had just been stroking, the old lord pushed himself up from his cushioned seat, his face lighting up with glee. He turned to his steward and commanded, "Our guests from White Harbor have arrived. Go, give them the finest welcome. The heir, Clay, is that his name? Invite him to see me at once." "Yes, my lord," the steward responded promptly, about to depart when Walder Frey suddenly called him back. "Remember, do not let my foolish sons or grandsons snatch up White Harbor's heir before he reaches me. Tell them to behave themselves." House Frey had risen to prominence as one of the most powerful noble families in the Riverlands, thanks entirely to their bridge over the Green Fork. Merchants and peasants alike had no choice but to pay a hefty toll to cross it, and it was through this strategic chokehold that the Freys became the second most powerful house in the Riverlands. To put it bluntly, without such an advantage, Walder Frey would never have been late Lord Frey, because if his house had been weak, he would never have had the luxury of choosing when and where to declare allegiance. Having witnessed firsthand the power that wealth could command, Walder Frey understood better than anyone the deep foundation of House Manderly, rulers of a prosperous port city. They were not a house famed for military might, yet no one dared to underestimate them. Everyone knew that with enough gold, one could raise an army. And even if the soldiers weren't the best, what of it? 3 men against 1 could always do the job. As long as one had gold dragons to spare, assembling an army was never a problem. Originally, Wylis Manderly of White Harbor had no male heir, and House Frey had made several attempts to arrange a marriage with his eldest daughter, Winifred. Walder Frey had no illusions about the scheme behind such a marriage, and Wyman Manderly had seen through it just as easily. He had simply rejected their offers and sent them on their way. At the time, Walder had given up on coveting White Harbor. But upon hearing of Clay's return, and more importantly, that he was not yet betrothed, his ambition reignited. Of course, if a marriage took place, it would be a Frey daughter marrying into House Manderly. But who was to say a woman could not wield influence over White Harbor? Look at Lisa Tully, the beloved wife of John Arryn. Through her son, Robert Arryn, she now held sway over the Vale. True, her grip on power seemed rather precarious, but that was Lisa's own failing. Walder Frey was confident that his daughters and granddaughters were far more capable. Thus, without hesitation, he sent out ravens to White Harbor, laying the groundwork for this very moment. And now, at last, his efforts bore fruit. The merman banner of House Manderly had arrived at the twins. The steward understood his lord's intentions perfectly. He acknowledged the order with a nod and swiftly departed. Meanwhile, Clay's retinue had reached the outskirts of the castle. Since the twins was not large enough to accommodate their entire force, even House Frey's own troops were stationed outside the walls. Clay had no choice but to leave most of his 200 cavalrymen behind. After some deliberation, his captain of the guard selected 50 men to accompany him across the fortified bridge leading into the castle. They had barely ridden past the bridgehead when the sentry who had been leading them finally dropped the pretense and spoke his mind. "My lord, allow me to take you to Esser Aenys Frey first. He is the third son of Lord Walder Frey. With him escorting you, it will be much easier to gain an audience with the lord." Since the sentry had abandoned the act, Clay saw no reason to play along either. Just as he was about to refuse, another rider in light armor, bearing the twin towers sigil of House Frey, galloped forward. It was clear the man had great confidence in his riding skills. He charged straight between Clay and the sentry, only to be stopped by White Harbor guards, their hands already gripping their sword hilts. The knight, noticing the wary expressions of Clay's men, forced an awkward smile onto his ugly, pockmarked face and introduced himself. "Which one of you is Lord Clay?" "I am Petter Frey, grandson of Esser Stevren Frey, the lord's eldest son." "Oh, great. Another Frey. And that name?" Clay couldn't say he liked it. He scrutinized the knight closely and noted that he wasn't much older than himself, likely about the same age. Yet, with his rough, blemished skin and dark complexion, he looked far older than his years. According to the intelligence he had gathered, Esser Stevren Frey, Petter's grandfather, was the rightful heir to Walder Frey. So, did this mean Petter was here representing the main branch of House Frey? Before Clay could reply, Petter abruptly lashed his riding crop across the sentry's back. The poor man, knowing he had failed his mission, dared not retaliate. He merely slinked away as Petter hurled insults at him. Having dealt with the sentry, Petter ignored the barely concealed disdain of the White Harbor Knights and repeated himself. "Lord Clay, I am Petter Frey, grandson of Esser Stevren Frey, the lord's eldest son. I will escort you to my grandfather, who will then take you to meet Lord Walder." Clay found the entire situation baffling. He had been personally invited by Walder Frey himself. Why did every single Frey here act as if he needed to go through them first? Who did they think they were looking down on? Still, standing here and ignoring this faction of Freys wasn't ideal either. Clay had come to the twins to navigate the situation skillfully, keeping all sides content without committing to any one of them. After a brief pause, he nudged his horse forward and replied calmly, "I am Clay Manderly." "Greetings, Esser Petter of House Frey, greetings." He did not say he agreed to meet Stevren Frey. He remained still, not moving his horse forward. In truth, he had no desire whatsoever to meet Stevren, even if the man was Walder Frey's designated heir. Just as he hesitated, an aged voice rang out, breaking the tense atmosphere. "Petter, step aside. Lord Walder has personally invited Lord Clay to the tower. You may return now." Seeing Petter's face twist in displeasure, Clay thought to himself, "I've barely been here a moment, and I've already encountered 3 or 4 Freys. The concentration of Freys in this castle is absurdly high." Chapter 51 Guests. The twins was not a large settlement. In fact, calling it a city would have been an overstatement, as its defining feature was its bridge. The so-called twins was, at its core, a fortified bridge spanning the river, flanked on either end by 2 massive strongholds that served as both bridgeheads and defensive fortresses. Clay and his party entered from the bridgehead fortress on the eastern bank of the Green Fork River. Now, they stood just inside the stronghold, not far from the entrance. He cast a brief glance at the man before him, someone clearly of higher standing within House Frey than Petter Frey, the great-grandson. Yet, Clay had no idea who he was. Petter left with an unsightly expression, unwilling to provoke the elderly steward who had served the lord for decades. Within House Frey, aside from a select few, who among them was not wary of this seemingly unremarkable old man? To cross him would be a grave mistake, for a single whispered word from the steward into the Lord's ear, and misfortune would surely follow. And with Lord Frey now 90 years old, his judgments on family matters had grown increasingly erratic and unpredictable. With the soldiers and knights gone, the stranger before Clay showed no intention of introducing himself. Instead, he simply turned and began leading the way. Seeing that Clay and his companions had not moved, he halted and added, "I am the Lord's steward. In this city, I doubt anyone would dare impersonate me. My lord has invited you to the main keep. He has prepared bread and salt for you." This was the well-known guest right of Westeros. A guest who partook of a host's bread and salt was granted protection. During their stay, neither party could harm the other. To violate this was to break a sacred law, one abhorred by both the old gods and the new. The nobility of Westeros did, in fact, uphold this tradition. Even amid the bloodiest battlefields and the most ruthless court intrigues, few had dared to trample upon it. Yet, in truth, it carried little binding force beyond custom and belief. Even so, Clay, who was well aware of House Frey's nature, had no faith in their adherence to any so-called sacred guest right. In some ways, his connection to magic placed him closer to the gods than most. Yet, he had never believed in the so-called divine wrath of either the old gods or the new. The Red Wedding had come and gone. House Frey had shattered guests' right, yet no immediate divine punishment had followed. Walder Frey's son had become the Lord of Riverrun, and the family's lands had expanded rapidly. As for the vengeance of the Brotherhood without banners and Arya Stark's ruthless assassinations, what did that have to do with the old gods or the new? That was nothing more than the Freys' own failure to guard against retribution. Taking a small bite of the slightly salty bread, Clay completed the guest rite ritual while standing in the great hall of the twins' main keep. Seated before him, elevated slightly above the hall, was an enormous black oak chair. A frail old man, clad in gray robes, sat hunched upon it, his small, beady eyes fixed upon Clay. There was no doubt, this was the Lord of the Crossing, Walder Frey, now 90 years old. Though he inwardly loathed it, Clay had no choice but to offer a formal greeting. By both age and status, the proper etiquette was for him to bow first. "The House of Manderly sends its regards. Esteemed Lord of Twins, Clay Manderly thanks you for your hospitality." There was nothing appealing about the smile of a decrepit old man with sagging skin, no hair, and no teeth, especially one who was as hideous as Walder Frey. Yet the Lord seemed pleased with Clay's demeanor. At the very least, this young heir was far more respectful than his grandfather, the old sea lamprey. In a hoarse voice, thick with age, Walder Frey spoke. "Welcome, Clay Manderly. I trust you will find the hospitality of the twins satisfactory. House Frey guarantees your safety." "I'd sooner drown myself in the Green Fork than believe that," Clay thought. Yet, his face remained all smiles as he placed a hand over his chest and bowed once more, formally concluding the guest rite ceremony. Under the steward's guidance, Clay left the great hall. There was still time before dusk, and the true meeting would take place at the evening banquet, where the key members of House Frey would gather, including the wives they had prepared for Clay Manderly. For some reason, though White Harbor lay by the sea and the twins by the river, the air here felt far damper. The moment he stepped inside his assigned chamber, Clay's keen sense of smell told him that somewhere in this room, mold was growing. The unpleasant living conditions made him frown. He threw open every window, but it was of little use. Outside, the Green Fork River rushed southward, its waters ever flowing. His 50 guards had been quartered in another building, alongside House Frey's own soldiers. However, at the insistence of his captain of the guard, 10 men, along with the captain himself, had been assigned quarters close to Clay's room. Once the steward had escorted him inside, the old man took his position at the stairwell, standing there like a withered tree that refused to fall. At first, Clay did not understand his purpose. But as shadowy figures repeatedly attempted to ascend the stairs, only to be turned away, it became clear. Walder Frey had placed a gatekeeper at his door. Oddly enough, Clay found himself pleased by the old lord's decision. He had no desire to be disturbed. At least, not for now. His captain of the guard insisted on inspecting the chamber, and Clay saw no reason to object. The devoted man had no way of knowing that Clay, having mastered the foundational swordsmanship techniques of the Wolf School, wielding 5 magical seals, and possessing a body resistant to most poisons, was not so easily killed. Besides, Clay had done nothing dishonorable regarding the arranged marriage. Why would House Frey want him dead? If he were to perish here, his grandfather would no doubt declare war on the twins at once. For now, he would remain inconspicuous and wait for the right moment to make contact with the White Sea Guard agents stationed here. Trying to decipher House Frey's convoluted web of kinship was a fool's errand. Intelligence reports from seasoned spies were far more reliable, even if he could only trust them halfway. As the sun sank toward the horizon, its glow turned crimson. Yet, here in the twins, Clay felt no trace of warmth. A firm knock sounded against the door. Alone in the chamber, Clay heard the steward's aged voice. "Lord Clay, the banquet is ready. The Lord invites you to the great hall for the feast. Please follow me." With a slight nod, Clay straightened his resplendent attire. Appearance often meant little, but in the right circumstances, it could be a powerful tool. He strode down the narrow, dimly lit corridors. After nearly 10 minutes, he arrived once more at the great hall he had visited earlier that day. Through the slightly ajar heavy oak doors, he heard the murmur of voices. Not a few individuals speaking loudly, but a collective hum, the sound of many conversing in hushed tones. It seemed Walder Frey had spoken truthfully, most of House Frey had gathered. Otherwise, the room would not have been so lively. Taking a deep breath, Clay pushed open the heavy doors that seemed to divide two worlds. Chapter 52. A game of pretenses. The arrival of Clay instantly silenced the somewhat noisy hall for a few brief moments. However, the hush did not last long. Soon, an elderly man, who appeared to be of a similar age, raised his cup and laughed heartily. "Welcome, our guest, Clay Manderly." His words were quickly echoed by many members of House Frey. Some raised their cups, while others pounded the dark-colored long table with their hands in response, producing a series of resounding thuds that reverberated through the hall. Lord Walder Frey extended a hand as dry and withered as old tree bark, gesturing toward a seat at the high table, signaling for Clay to take his place. Tonight, Clay was the guest of honor in this hall. Clay did not hesitate in the slightest. Striding forward confidently, he seated himself in the chair that had been prepared for him. Lord Frey regarded him with a keen eye, his voice carrying a grave tone as he spoke. "It seems the old lamprey of White Harbor has found himself a worthy successor, unlike me, who is left with nothing but a brood of foolish sons and grandsons." Clay's brows furrowed slightly, though he kept the movement subtle. If it were anyone else speaking of his grandfather in such a manner, he would not have tolerated it. However, the man before him was 90 years old, older than Clay and his grandfather combined. All Clay could do was curse inwardly. Choosing not to respond, he sat quietly, waiting for the Lord to continue. According to the intelligence he had received beforehand, Walder Frey was a man with a deep-rooted sense of family. And indeed, the old man was unfazed by Clay's silence. Instead, he seemed rather pleased as he enthusiastically began introducing his many family members. Pointing toward the man who had welcomed Clay upon his arrival, Walder Frey said, "Stevran Frey, my eldest son and heir. He's older than even your grandfather, such is the fate of having a father like me." After saying this, the Lord let out a laugh, seemingly delighted, though whether it was due to his heir or his own longevity remained unclear. Either way, he downed a large gulp of red wine, his laughter hoarse and cackling, reminiscent of a night owl's call. "The boy who stopped you on the road earlier, Petter, is his grandson," he added. Though the words were spoken with a smile, there was a lightness to his tone that made Clay notice the subtle shift in Stevran Frey's expression. With just one sentence, the old lord had not only asserted his absolute control over the flow of information within the twins but had also subtly put his son in his place. It was clear that this sprawling House Frey was far more complicated internally than it seemed. Clay nodded politely toward Stevran Frey. There was no need to withhold the basic courtesies. After moving on from his eldest, Walder Frey pointed to the other end of the long table, where a tall, bald man sat. "This is my third son, Aenys. As for my second son, well, that lad is being held on a tight leash by his wife, that golden-haired Lannister lioness of his. I haven't seen him here in quite some time." Clay was well aware of the situation. Rivers, his steward, had specifically mentioned it in a report. Walder Frey's second son, Emmon, was strongly inclined toward the Lannisters. The reason for this was simple: his wife was a Lannister. And her backing was solid as a rock, for her brother was none other than Tywin Lannister. In the report, Rivers had strongly advised Clay against engaging with Emmon Frey or any of his children who remained in the twins. There was no benefit to be gained, and Clay fully agreed with the assessment. As the feast continued, the Lord went on to introduce the rest of his sons who were present at the banquet. As for his numerous grandsons, the 90-year-old seemed to lack the patience to acknowledge them. Clay gave each of these sons, whose age differences spanned over 50 years, a polite nod. Though, truth be told, their appearances were rather unremarkable. Whether due to bloodline or sheer misfortune, the men of House Frey all seemed to share a weasel-like visage. Once the introductions were concluded, Walder Frey clinked his cup, officially announcing the start of the feast. The hall erupted into a lively clamor. Most of those invited had little to do with the evening's true purpose. They were not here for Clay, but rather, had come simply in response to the Lord's summons. However, a few individuals were exceptions. The long tables were pushed apart, leaving a large open space in the center of the hall, a designated area for dancing. Such was the custom at noble feasts in Westeros. Seeing that Clay had not made any move to take the floor, Walder Frey cast a glance at his steward. Taking the cue, a group of Frey men and women stepped into the dance area, filling the silence and dissolving the slight awkwardness that had lingered earlier. Clay knew how to dance, but only in the way a child might recall long-forgotten lessons. He was far from skilled. At first, he had worried that his lack of proficiency might bring shame upon White Harbor. However, after watching the Freys dancing, he realized his concerns had been entirely unnecessary. It was not outright atrocious, but to put it plainly, it was little more than pairs of men and women clinging to each other and hopping about. Many hands seemed unable to remain in proper places, wandering eagerly in search of something to grope. Such was the norm for most of them. Clay was well aware that he would have to dance at some point tonight. However, for now, he remained seated, maintaining a pleasant smile as he sipped his wine, occasionally offering words of approval. During this time, he became acutely aware of at least 5 or 6 gazes lingering on him. Without making it obvious, he subtly shifted his angle, discreetly scanning the sources of these stares. Women. 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 And more women. From what he could tell, their ages ranged from as young as 12 or 13 to nearly 30. It did not take much to understand the situation. This was the Frey family's way of presenting him with potential matches. His moment of quiet observation did not last long. One of the Frey women who had been watching him adjusted her skirts and began walking in his direction. Almost simultaneously, Stevran Frey's voice reached Clay's ears. "Lord Clay, this is my granddaughter, Valda, who is about the same age as you." The implications were clear. Hearing the name and realizing she was Stevran's granddaughter, Clay instantly connected the dots. This was the first Valda Frey mentioned in the reports. Clay could feel the weight of many eyes subtly flickering between himself and this Valda Frey. He did not particularly enjoy the attention, but it did not bother him either, because, quite frankly, he did not care. Valda Frey, supposedly known as Fair Valda, had a voice that suited her age, young and crisp. But if Clay were to be completely honest, he did not believe her looks warranted such a title. At best, she was passable. "Lord Clay, may I have this dance?" Valda Frey asked without much hesitation, her tone direct. For the moment, this was not a request Clay could refuse. Setting down his wine cup, which bore the engraved sigil of the Twin Bridges, he rose to his feet. Under Stevran Frey's approving gaze, Clay accepted Valda Frey's outstretched hand. Chapter 53. A sleepless night. The air was thick with an overpowering fragrance of perfume. With stiff steps, Clay half-heartedly responded to the clearly rehearsed questions from Valda Frey. As a man, he naturally appreciated a woman's flattery. However, when he was fully aware that every word had been carefully prepared in advance, any sense of achievement that might have been ingrained in his very genes dissipated faster than a wisp of smoke. Valda Frey's attire was also quite deliberate, tightly fitted, to be precise, clearly an attempt to accentuate her rather ample bosom. Throughout their dance, Clay had felt, more than once, a soft and yielding pressure against him, whether it was one or two at a time. Discreetly sidestepping, Clay remained utterly composed, as if nothing had happened. At moments like this, keeping a close watch on his own impulses was of utmost importance. After all, he was well aware of the notorious cunning of the Frey family and could clearly see through their intentions toward him. What was interesting, however, was that as he spun around with his arms wrapped around Valda Frey's waist, his gaze happened to land on a thick stone pillar in the hall. Leaning against it, partially concealed in the shadows, stood a dark figure. A strange sensation pricked at Clay's mind, an unshakable feeling that this person was watching him with quiet but unmistakable hostility. How should he describe it? It felt like the piercing gaze of a love rival. TCH, I knew there'd be trouble like this. Clay scoffed inwardly. The Frey family was extremely large, and their younger members struggling to control their own impulses was nothing unusual. When the dance came to an end, Clay let go of Valda Frey's hand without hesitation. He offered her a polite smile, using his back to shield himself from the slightly resentful look in her eyes before turning away and returning to his seat. Instead of touching the cup he had left on the table earlier, he signaled to a passing servant for a fresh drink. Although, as a witcher, he had no fear of ordinary poisons, if there were any, he still saw no reason to take unnecessary risks. He knew that his actions would undoubtedly be noticed by Lord Walder Frey, who was seated at the high table. But what of it? Did they really expect him to arrive in an unfamiliar place and naively drink whatever was placed before him? That would accomplish nothing except making him look like a fool. Clay clinked his cup lightly against the one offered by Sir Stevran Frey and heard the old knight's inquiry. Lord Clay, my granddaughter is quite charming, isn't she? To be frank, she is the most beautiful girl on both banks of the Green Fork. The words were blunt, leaving Clay with no choice but to smile and offer a few courteous remarks in response. His gaze, however, drifted toward Valda Frey, who had returned to her seat and was now chattering away with a group of Frey women. He sighed inwardly. A month ago, she probably had no idea who he was, yet now she approached him carrying the full weight of her family's intentions, even resorting to seduction. How much of it was genuine? Only she would know. Fate truly worked in unpredictable ways. As the banquet drew to a close, Clay took a quick tally. He had danced with Sir Stevran's two granddaughters, as well as Lord Jafer Frey's granddaughter. He had also spent some time conversing with a 13-year-old granddaughter of Aenys Frey about his experiences in Essos. Oh, and then there was Alex Frey, the daughter of Simon Frey. She held a higher rank in lineage than the others, yet she was a year or two younger than Valda Frey. All in all, after enduring an evening surrounded by nothing but Frey women, even a witcher's strong nerves left Clay feeling utterly drained, as though his very soul had been hollowed out. The hosts and guests all appeared to be enjoying themselves, or at least, on the surface, that was the case. When Lord Walder Frey, due to his advanced age, retired early to rest, the banquet only grew rowdier. Coarse shouts echoed through the hall, mixed with occasional shrieks from women, creating a scene of utter revelry, practically a den of debauchery. Seeing an opportunity, Clay feigned intoxication, allowing his long-awaited savior, the captain of his White Harbor Guard, to escort him back to his chambers. Young lord, are you all right? Once they had ensured no one else was present, the captain dismissed the guards to stand watch outside and shut the door behind him. He then turned to Clay, who had, by this point, completely sobered up. The question in his eyes was clear. Do you really think your young lord would let those Freys drink him under the table so easily? Clay shot him a sidelong glare, his tone exasperated. Even the slowest of men would have realized it by now. Clay had been faking his drunkenness all along. The captain's eyes flickered as if he were considering something. Clay noticed that the man's gaze was somewhat peculiar, sweeping over him repeatedly as if hesitating to speak. After a long pause, the captain finally muttered cautiously, "Young lord, we won't be standing guard tonight. If anything happens, just call us loudly." With that, he left swiftly, a knowing smirk playing on his lips, one that only men would understand. What the hell? Wait, what exactly are you all imagining? Clay was utterly dumbfounded. He wasn't worried that his guards would neglect their duty, but he truly had not anticipated such an expression from them. Time passed quickly. Outside the window, the moon had traveled a considerable distance across the night sky. As the hustle and bustle of the twins gradually faded, Clay knew that the banquet had finally drawn to a close. His plan was to stay here for a week, then find a suitable excuse for his father to summon him back via Raven. In truth, how he returned was irrelevant, as this invitation had never truly been about a marriage alliance in the first place. With White Harbor backing him, Clay seriously doubted the Freys would be bold enough to coerce him into signing any binding agreement or forcibly tying him to a Frey woman. Unless, at that thought, a realization dawned upon him. He finally understood the meaning behind his captain's cryptic smirk earlier. Just then, he heard a faint noise. The door to his room was being carefully opened. Someone had unlocked the latch. Who could it be? Clay's senses immediately sharpened. His hand instinctively reached for the longsword he had deliberately placed beside his bed. The blade was unsheathed, it had remained that way all night. Should danger arise, he wouldn't need to waste time drawing it. But then, a familiar scent filled the air, a heavy perfume. One he had encountered just hours ago. Valda Frey. By the gods, why is she here? In the dim moonlight, Clay saw Valda Frey tiptoe into the room, dressed in a different outfit from before. Clearly, she had not expected him to be awake. The moment their eyes met, she visibly froze, her expression shifting rapidly. Miss Valda Frey, it is quite late. You, Clay, feeling awkward, attempted to break the silence. But before he could finish speaking, he saw Valda Frey's hand move to the strap of her gown. In that instant, if he still didn't understand her intentions, he would have to be a complete fool. She was trying to turn the metaphorical uncooked rice into cooked rice. Is this really necessary? He could already hear the subtle shift in her breathing, becoming heavier, more deliberate. At that moment, Clay sprang up from his reclined position. Oh, hell no. This cannot happen. He groaned inwardly. Chapter 54. The Axii sign is truly useful. Though the opportunity had presented itself, Clay had absolutely no interest in engaging with Valda Frey, who, at best, could be considered passably attractive. Getting involved with her would only invite endless trouble. My lord, let me. Before she could even finish her passionate words, Valda Frey found her vision suddenly filled with Clay's outstretched palm. A faint green rune in the shape of an inverted triangle flickered briefly before disappearing. Thank goodness for the Axii sign. Clay thought to himself. This unexpected development had caught him completely off guard, leaving him with almost no time to react. Fortunately, his Witcher signs had come to his rescue. For now, Valda Frey, disheveled, with certain parts of her body already exposed to the open air, was under control. Clay let out a quiet sigh of relief. To avoid any further distractions, he issued a simple command. Put your clothes back on and stand by the door. Now, the most pressing issue was to determine whether this was her own doing or if someone had sent her. If it was merely her personal initiative, then the situation was simple. Afterward, he could just tell her that nothing had happened, and that would be the end of it. But if someone had orchestrated this, then things would become significantly more complicated. That would mean that Valda Frey's actions were being monitored, and the longer she remained in his room, the greater the risk he faced. The thought made Clay inwardly curse himself for not stopping the captain of the guards from leaving earlier. TCH, this is my own fault for being too naive. He had realized the scheme too late and had foolishly overestimated the moral bottom line of these Freys. There was no use dwelling on that now. Clay quickly composed himself and made a decision. Valda Frey, he asked, his voice calm yet firm, did someone send you to me tonight? The woman, her eyes now dull and lifeless, stood with her back to him. Her response came in a mechanical, emotionless tone. Yes, my lord. My father, Walton Frey, told me to climb into your bed. He plans to come find you in the morning. Stop. That's enough. Clay was speechless. What kind of twisted version of a honey trap is this? He had actually encountered something so absurd. What unbelievable misfortune. Besides your father, does anyone else know you came to see me? My grandfather, Stevrin, was aware, but he opposed my father's plan. At least there weren't too many people involved. And since Walton Frey wouldn't come looking until the next morning, this gave Clay some time to devise a countermeasure. Still, what kind of lunatics were these people? They were in such a rush to push their daughter onto him. Were they not worried that he might just take what they offered without acknowledging anything afterward? Clay now realized that he had completely underestimated how desperately the Frey family wanted to tie him, the heir of White Harbor, to them by making one of their daughters his legitimate wife. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering. The room fell into silence. Though it was just the two of them alone, not a trace of intimacy lingered in the air. After a moment, Clay spoke again. Valda Frey, tonight, You indeed came looking for Clay Manderly. However, you mistook his room's location and never found him. Now, leave. Return to your quarters and go to sleep. No matter what, he had to get this woman away from him immediately. If anything else unexpected happened, even if he was innocent, there would be no way to explain himself. Yes, my lord. Her reply was still as stiff and robotic as before. Slowly, Valda Frey turned and walked out of the room. Clay kept his gaze fixed on her until she descended the stairs and disappeared from sight. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. Without wasting another second, he turned on his heels and strode directly toward a nearby room, the quarter of the captain of his guards. Just as he reached the door and raised his hand to knock, the heavy oak door creaked open on its own. Under the flickering candlelight from the hallway, Clay saw the guard captain standing there, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps amusement. Come inside. We need to talk. Clay's voice was cold. If this man had not deliberately misinterpreted his earlier words and left him to deal with this situation alone, none of this would have happened. Do he have any idea how close I just came to getting devoured by one of those Frey women? The guard captain immediately sensed that his young lord was in a foul mood. He had been watching through the gap in his door when Valda Frey had arrived. His gaze had lingered appreciatively on her voluptuous figure, even feeling a tinge of envy toward Clay. As for the potential consequences of the situation, that thought hadn't even crossed his mind. To him, this sort of thing was common among nobles. If a woman came willingly, you simply enjoyed the moment and then denied everything afterward. That was how the game was played. Yet, just moments after he had secretly mocked his young lord's restraint, he saw Valda Frey leaving Clay's room with stiff, unnatural movements. Before he could even process the scene properly, Clay had appeared at his door, looking utterly livid. You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? The question caught the guard captain off guard. Unable to gauge Clay's true intent, he hesitated before answering honestly. My lord, I assumed that since you weren't drunk, you were simply waiting for something like this. Miss Valda's actions aren't uncommon among noble circles. I thought you. Clay was once again at a loss for words. What could he even say? That he was simply too virtuous. Or that the captain was the one overthinking things. After a long silence, Clay decided to drop the matter entirely. He issued his next command instead. From now on, speak plainly. No more of this. I know, you know, nonsense. Take your men and ensure that no one enters my quarters for the rest of the night. The guard captain stood there, momentarily stunned. When he glanced into Clay's room and saw everything still in perfect order, realization struck him like a hammer. Nothing had happened. Suddenly, cold sweat broke out on his back. I misunderstood everything. He had thought his young lord had been prepared for this encounter, when in reality, Clay had been caught completely off guard. Had he left things unchecked, the situation could have spiraled out of control. Without another word, he gathered the guards who had been given the night off. Ignoring their complaints, he stationed them throughout the halls, ensuring no corner was left unwatched. This time, he would not make another mistake. His young lord had spared him once, but that did not mean he would be so lucky a second time. Meanwhile, Clay sat alone in his dimly lit room, rubbing his temples as he mulled over the situation. Clay had not made his decision on how to handle Valda Frey on a whim. While his Axii sign was not yet potent enough to erase memories entirely, it was more than sufficient to cloud her mind and warp her recollection of events. By the time she returned to her chambers, she would be none the wiser to the fact that she had been hypnotized. In her mind, two conflicting thoughts would coexist, one insisting that she had gotten lost and never reached Clay's room, and another whispering that she had indeed visited him but had ultimately failed in her task. No matter how confused she was, she would understand one thing: her mission had failed. And that was all that mattered. By morning, when Walton Frey came looking for her, he would find nothing. There would be no proof that she had spent the night with Clay. Any accusations she made would be hollow, lacking the weight to sway anyone. What a mess. Clay exhaled, pressing his forehead into his palm as he watched the candlelight flicker. Sleep was no longer an option. This incident had made one thing painfully clear: compared to the old noble houses of Westeros, he had far too many principles. And that was not a good thing. In a world rife with schemes and betrayals, having a lower moral threshold often meant living a longer life. for those who clung too tightly to their own sense of justice. In the end, it was often their own righteousness that consumed them. Chapter 55. The Castle Gate. The next morning, just as the impatient Walton Frey led his men in an attempt to storm into the Manderly residence, only to be stopped at the entrance by the captain of the guard. When tensions between the two sides were on the verge of erupting, a Frey retainer with a strange expression suddenly rode in, bringing news that left Walton Frey utterly dumbfounded. His daughter, Valda Frey, was not in the Manderly residence at all. Instead, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, obediently staying in her own chambers. The Axii sign had not only prevented her from carrying out the task assigned by her father but had also tampered with her memory, leaving her unaware of her original intentions. Furious and exasperated, Walton Frey stormed out in haste. As for how he would deal with his confused daughter, that was no concern of Clay's. With a flick of his fingers, shimmering magical energy extinguished the candlelight, and the icy power of the Ard sign dissipated. Standing atop the high platform, Clay watched the departing Freys with cold, indifferent eyes. This was nothing like the predicament Robb Stark and the Northern Army would later face. Trapped beneath the walls of the twins, compelled to accept a marriage pact with House Frey in a desperate bid to cross the river and seize the advantage. Clay had no such concerns. He could marry whomever he wished, or no one at all. At least on the surface, there was no one with a legitimate claim to force his hand. This was precisely why he had dared to come to the twins so decisively. After finishing his breakfast, Clay set out from the residence with his guards. The social obligations of the previous day were behind him. Now, he could focus on what truly mattered. Closely studying this fortress on the Green Fork. House Frey had occupied this place for 600 years. Ever since they built this stronghold, no army had ever successfully breached its walls in a frontal assault. It was not that the fortress was protected by some powerful enchantment. In truth, it was nothing more than an ordinary fort built of brick and stone, with walls that were hardly impressive. At least in Clay's eyes, the defenses of the twins were nothing compared to the massive barriers of White Harbor. However, what made the fortress formidable was the great advantage it possessed. The ever-flowing Green Fork River that ran through its center. The presence of this river made it impossible for an enemy force to completely encircle the fortress. In fact, even surrounding half of it was an impractical feat, as both the eastern and western keeps had only one side facing the shore. To make matters worse, the limited size of the fortresses meant that the battlefield for any siege would be extremely constrained. Even if an attacking army had overwhelming numbers, only a small portion of their troops could be deployed at a time, reducing any siege to a series of costly, incremental assaults. Before Aegon's conquest, the twins had rarely faced serious threats, as they lay far from the main battlefields of the Riverlands. Meanwhile, the exorbitant toll fees they charged for crossing had allowed House Frey to maintain a standing force of 3,000 men. Over time, this seemingly insignificant fortress and its ruling family had steadily grown in power, becoming a stubborn stone in the Green Fork, one that could not be easily washed away. At present, no one in the north had given any thought to what would happen if this bridge truly stood in their way. But Clay, who knew that war was inevitable and that preparations must be made in advance, had come to the fortress personally to search for its weaknesses. The part of the fortress Clay was currently in was the keep on the eastern bank of the Green Fork, where House Frey's main stronghold was located. Naturally, he decided to begin his observations from the eastern gate. Clay was no expert in military strategy, but that did not mean others were equally ignorant. During their journey, he had casually gathered insights from his captain of the guard, an old soldier who had fought in Robert's rebellion, and had gained a basic understanding of how a fortress like this might be taken. House Frey had stationed men at the entrance of the Manderly residence, keeping a watchful eye on Clay's movements. The moment he stepped outside, a short-statured Frey, whose name Clay neither knew nor cared to learn, scurried up to him, his face plastered with a fawning smile. "My Lord Clay, where might you be headed?" Clay glanced at this insignificant figure with little interest and replied indifferently, "I'm going to take a look at the city walls." "There's no need for you to follow. Under the sun's bright light, I'm sure there's nothing I do here that your lord won't already know about, is there?" Patting the Frey retainer on the shoulder, Clay left him standing there awkwardly as he continued toward the castle gate with his guards. The small fortress was surprisingly lively. Vendors of all sorts had set up their stalls along the roadside, loudly hawking their wares, odd trinkets that even Clay couldn't identify. Now and then, soldiers clad in armor bearing the sigil of the Twin Towers passed through, yet they made no effort to drive the street vendors away. It was not that they were particularly benevolent. Rather, the toll collected at the castle gate had already fattened their purses to the point that they had no interest in bullying these impoverished peddlers. Feigning interest, Clay instructed his guards to browse the market stalls, purchasing a few items while he made his way toward the castle gate. There, he positioned himself to the side, his gaze sweeping over the bustling crowd as he carefully examined the eastern gate of the twins. The gate was constructed of thick black steel bars, each as wide as Clay's lower leg. Beyond the bars stood a large black oaken door. Clay had taken note of it when he first entered the fortress. It was not particularly thick, meaning it likely provided little in terms of actual defense. However, in times of war, an attacking force would first need to destroy this wooden gate before they could even attempt to breach the reinforced steel portcullis behind it. After scrutinizing the gate for some time, Clay reached a conclusion. There were two possible approaches to overcoming this obstacle. The first was to prevent the gate from being lowered in the first place, or to have someone raise it during a siege. This, of course, presented a challenge. How could he ensure that someone loyal to him was in the right place at the right time to control the gate mechanism? He thought of his White Sea Guard. Perhaps this should be their next objective. Coincidentally, he had intended to seek out the White Sea Guard stationed here to gather information. The second option was to bypass the gate entirely. If his army could maintain a siege for long enough, he could employ skilled craftsmen to tunnel beneath the gate. White Harbor had artisans capable of such work. However, this approach required time. If the situation demanded swift action, it would have to remain a secondary option. If only he had a few mammoths, he mused to himself. With those beasts, he could simply tear the gate down and be done with it. After selecting a few trinkets that caught his interest, Clay watched as his guards returned, each carrying the items they had purchased. Once the last of them had rejoined him, he gave a brief nod, offered a casual remark about their taste in goods, and then led them up onto the castle walls. In White Harbor, when he had stood upon the battlements, his view had been filled with the vast expanse of the sea, bustling sailors, and the lively crowds of the city. But here, standing atop these walls, Clay felt an inexplicable sense of decay and stagnation. Not just because of the twin-towered banners fluttering in the wind, but also because of the moss that crept through the cracks between the bricks. The damp air from the Green Fork had thoroughly seeped into the fortress, leaving it clammy and damp. On the wall, Clay unexpectedly spotted a familiar figure, Heir Aenys Frey, the third son of Lord Walder Frey, whom he had met at the feast the night before. Chapter 56 The Transaction. The moment his eyes met those of Aenys Frey, Clay knew at once. The man had been waiting for him here on purpose. It was clear that, within the halls of the twins, quite a few Freys were keeping a close watch on him. As this realization settled in, Clay instinctively raised his guard. Yet, his expression remained warm and amicable, a practiced smile curving his lips. With a subtle hand gesture, he signaled his captain of the guard to halt before stepping forward alone. Though he had no desire to entangle himself in the Freys' web of family intrigue, the encounter before him was unavoidable. Their paths had already crossed, and turning away now was not an option. The last thing he wanted was for rumors to spread that Clay Manderly of White Harbor had retreated at the mere sight of a Frey. This had nothing to do with personal pride or honor. Rather, it was simply because a significant portion of both Northmen and even some Southerners placed great importance on such things. Even if there had been nothing to it at first, rumors had a way of twisting the truth, making something out of nothing. And that was the last thing Clay wanted. He did not stray too far from his guards, keeping a careful balance, far enough that their conversation would not appear as secretive scheming, yet close enough that his men would struggle to overhear their words. Instead of walking directly to where Aenys Frey stood, Clay gestured toward a section of the battlements and made his way there first. Though Heir Aenys was old enough to be 3 times his age, Westeros was not a land where mere years commanded respect. This was not a meeting between a youth and an elder, it was a discussion between House Manderly and House Frey. In matters of nobility, there was no place for such courtesies. Leaning against the damp stone wall, Clay cast his gaze beyond the castle, toward the lush, verdant forest he had passed through on his way here. Heir Aenys followed soon after, taking up a position along a nearby section of the battlements. For a moment, neither spoke. A quiet assessment passed between them. Clay was in no hurry. He wanted to see what this third-born Frey, who had deliberately sought him out, intended to say. After 3 or 4 minutes of silence, Ser Aenys Frey finally spoke. He had come to realize that the young man before him possessed remarkable patience. Clay would not be the first to break the quiet. Left with no other choice, he was forced to ask a question that had no real standard answer. Lord Clay, what do you think of our house Frey? Clay's expression remained unchanged. Meeting the older man's gaze, he answered without hesitation, my opinion is irrelevant. The only thing that truly matters to you is Lord Walder Frey's opinion, his attitude toward you, and more importantly, his attitude toward House Frey as a whole. Over the past few days, Clay had come to understand that Walder Frey's grip over his family was nothing short of absolute. Every single member of the Frey household feared him, while simultaneously bending over backward to curry his favor. A lively feast could be silenced in an instant by nothing more than the old man's cough. Even if that cough was simply the result of wine going down the wrong way. Walder Frey could humiliate any member of his house at will, reducing even the most senior among them to a pitiful state, regardless of whether they were now old enough to be called grandfather by their own descendants. Ser Aenys Frey had not expected such an incisive answer. He had anticipated a vague or superficial response from this strikingly handsome Manderly youth. Instead, Clay's words had struck directly at the heart of the matter. Slowly nodding, the 50-something-year-old knight realized he could no longer judge this young Manderly by age alone. You are right, Aenys Frey said at last. My father has sat upon that black chair for decades, since before I was born. And now, my grandson, Jonos, is 7 years old, yet my father remains firmly seated upon it. Ha! My brother Stevran and his cubs, how pitiful. They have waited for decades. A sigh of lament escaped the knight's lips, as if he truly felt sorrow for his brother Stevran and the long, bitter years of waiting he had endured. Clay mirrored his expression, adopting an air of regret. But in truth, his guard was up more than ever, his wariness sharpened to the extreme. Because anyone with a shred of intelligence could see the true meaning behind Aenys Frey's words. He wasn't sympathizing with his brother at all. He was lamenting his own misfortune. More importantly, if he had shared these sentiments with another Frey, Clay wouldn't have been the least bit surprised. But why was he confiding in an outsider, a mere visitor from White Harbor? What was his goal? The two of them had only met once before, they were barely acquainted. Did Aenys Frey not fear that Clay might turn around and relay everything to his father, Walder Frey? Clay's smile did not waver, though he could feel his own expression threatening to stiffen from the effort. Yet, as if his previous words had never left his lips, the older knight suddenly changed the subject. Lord Clay, I have heard that your esteemed grandfather, Lord Wyman, has 2 granddaughters whose beauty is renowned throughout the north. Ah, your 2 sisters, is that correct? Clay immediately thought of his elder sister, Winifred. Based purely on appearance, she certainly lived up to her reputation. Her beauty was indeed spoken of across the north. But when he thought of his younger sister, Willa, with her still round, childlike face, he knew at least half of this claim was pure nonsense. What was this old man getting at? Why bring up Winifred and Willa now? A sense of foreboding settled over him. And sure enough, his instincts proved correct. The bald, gray-whiskered old Frey spoke again. Finally laying out his true intentions. Lord Clay, I hear that neither of the young ladies of House Manderly are betrothed. How could that be? My grandson, Robert Frey, named after King Robert himself, would be honored beyond words to wed one of them. If such a union were to come to pass, I assure you, House Frey would be your eternal ally. Of course, this would require both your support and that of your entire house. At that moment, Clay fully understood why Ser Aenys had wasted so many words before getting to the point. This man was clearly well versed in the art of empty promises. First, he had painted a picture of internal strife within House Frey, hinting at his and his brother Stevran's shared resentment toward their father's enduring rule. They did not wish for their father to live much longer. Then, he had begun to lure Clay in with grand assurances, using his grandson's marriage proposal as bait. The unspoken deal was clear. If Clay helped arrange this marriage and supported Aenys Frey when the time came for action, he would be handsomely rewarded. But why was Aenys so certain that Clay would entangle himself in this reckless scheme? Whether this plan was hastily conceived or the result of long contemplation, whether he was testing Clay or making a genuine offer, one thing was certain. Aenys Frey harbored ambitions for House Frey's succession. There was no reason for Lord Walder Frey to send his third son to probe Clay on such matters. This had to be Aenys's own initiative. Now, Clay could see his true intent. He sought to use Winifred or Willa's marriage as a chain, binding House Manderly to his ambitions. And once that happened, no matter what Aenys wished to do, Clay would be forced to adopt a supportive or at least acquiescent stance, unless he was willing to gamble with the safety of his sisters. A curse formed in Clay's mind. He didn't mind when people tried to outmaneuver him, but he refused to be played for a fool. Your grandson. Even if the Green Fork flowed upstream, it still wouldn't be enough. He kept his thoughts to himself, but in his heart, the answer was already clear. Chapter 57 Rejection from an emotional standpoint. Even if Clay were given 10,000 chances to decide, he would never allow his family to marry into such a household. A vast and treacherous family like this, filled with endless scheming and power struggles, one would likely find it impossible to sleep soundly at night. If he were to approach the matter purely from the perspective of his position as White Harbor's heir, considering only the benefits to his family, then it would be an opportunity worth seizing. In the past, when his grandfather took his elder sister, Winifred, to Winterfell, Robb had likely not yet come of age to understand such matters. Thinking about the later descriptions of Robb Stark's wife, Jane Westerling, Clay couldn't help but ponder. Rather than marrying into an obscure branch of House Frey, why not consider the Stark family instead? House Frey's greatest advantage lay in their control over the bridge, a key passage that could block the Northern Army from crossing the Green Fork during wartime. However, if Clay's journey south proved successful and he discovered a way to bypass or take control of this bridge, then House Frey, aside from its 3,000 soldiers, would hold no real value. Therefore, even from a purely rational standpoint, Clay had no reason whatsoever to agree to this marriage proposal. More importantly, he had already given his word to his sister, Winifred. As the heir to White Harbor and the undisputed future lord of the city, Clay held the authority to influence the marriages of his family's women. This was precisely why Sir Aenys Frey had approached him. In fact, even before Clay's arrival, House Frey had already deliberated over the matter. Beyond attempting to secure a marriage alliance with Clay himself, they had also considered proposing matches for either Winifred or Willa, particularly with the eldest Frey daughter, Wilfred. Observing Sir Aenys Frey's expression, which appeared utterly sincere and devoid of deception, Clay inwardly scoffed. Sir, your proposal is indeed generous, but unfortunately, such a significant matter must be discussed with my grandfather, as well as my sister and younger sister. I deeply respect their opinions. His face was equally sincere, his brows furrowed ever so slightly, a touch of hesitation flickering in his expression, as if he genuinely supported Sir Aenys Frey's plan, yet simply lacked the authority to decide. The elderly Frey, now past 50, was visibly displeased by Clay's response. Stroking the gray-white tuft of his beard, he scoffed with evident disdain. Clay, you are the heir to White Harbor, the most valued descendant of the old lamprey. Why can you not make this decision? It is your rightful authority as the family's successor. The moment those words left Sir Aenys Frey's mouth, Clay's expression darkened, his earlier amicable facade vanishing in an instant. He despised the condescending, lecturing tone in those words. Did this Frey from the twins truly believe Clay needed to be taught his own rights and responsibilities? Did he think Clay was ignorant of what he could and could not do? Fixing his gaze on Sir Aenys Frey's slightly reddened, damp-looking eyes, Clay's voice turned cold. The affairs of House Manderly are ours to decide. That is not your concern, Sir. No matter how dense Aenys Frey was, even he understood that no agreement would be reached here. Clay, whom he had dismissed as young and hot-tempered, had made that abundantly clear. Sir Aenys Frey's expression soured. He muttered a few vulgar Riverlands curses under his breath before storming off in frustration. But between the two men, only they knew how much of that anger was genuine and how much was mere pretense. As Frey departed, the captain of Clay's guards, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the exchange, stepped forward. Narrowing his eyes at the retreating figure, he lowered his voice and asked, "Young lord, what just happened?" "Nothing significant," Clay replied coolly. Aenys Frey was trying to arrange a marriage between his grandson and Winifred or Willa. "Over my dead body." Remember. Tell the men not to speak of this meeting. The captain immediately nodded in acknowledgement of Clay's order. However, he couldn't quite understand the young lord's barely concealed hostility toward House Frey. After all, the North and the Riverlands had once fought side by side in the rebellion against House Targaryen. Although Lord Frey had been late to join, the veteran soldiers still held a favorable opinion of the Riverlands nobility. Concerned for Clay, the captain hesitated before finally voicing his thoughts. Young lord, did House Frey do something to offend you? Clay shook his head. Not to that extent. Why do you ask? Well, you seem to strongly dislike them. I mean no offense, but given that we are on Frey land, perhaps it would be wise to avoid conflict with them. Clay understood the captain's concerns, but he was fully aware of the stakes. He had no intention of stirring unnecessary trouble with the Freys. Let me ask you this. How many unmarried children does Lord Walder Frey have? I'm not sure, my lord. But I know it's a lot. Though puzzled by the question, the captain answered honestly. Clay chuckled. Retracting his hand from the damp stone of the castle wall, he brushed back the strands of hair tousled by the wind. Then, resting his hand lightly on the captain's shoulder, he spoke softly. No, you do know. The word, a lot, is telling enough. There are too many Freys. The name itself holds little value. There is absolutely no need for us to send one of our own into that graveyard of a family for the sake of potential Frey support. He never expected hardened warriors like his guards to fully grasp the intricacies of noble politics. Westeros was a land bound by rigid class structures. If one was not born a noble, it was nearly impossible to think like one. Foolish nobles certainly existed, and in great numbers. But for the most part, nobility produced individuals who understood the game. The humid, stifling wind from the green fork brushed against Clay's skin, leaving behind an unpleasant, sticky sensation. Yet, in just this brief moment, he had already cast aside his thoughts of Aenys Frey. Let's go, he said to the captain, who was still frowning in contemplation. Let's continue surveying the walls. The captain quickly snapped out of his thoughts and followed closely behind, keeping pace with Clay. Their footsteps echoed against the moss-covered stone bricks. It seemed rain had fallen recently. Small puddles still lingered in the crevices of the weathered walls. The Frey soldiers stationed along the path had no idea what had just transpired between Clay and Aenys. Even if they had known, they likely wouldn't have cared. At the twins, military power rested solely in the hands of Lord Walder Frey. Aside from his eldest son, Esser Stevran Frey, who commanded a small retinue of his own, the rest of Walder Frey's numerous offspring were forbidden from maintaining more than 50 armed men within the castle. As the White Harbor men passed, clad in armor adorned with the silver merman of House Manderly, the Frey soldiers made no move to obstruct them. These northerners were esteemed guests of the Lord of the Twins. It was not their place to intervene. Clay strolled leisurely, unhurried as he ascended the gatehouse and made his way along the southern section of the wall, surveying its condition with a keen eye. By the time he returned to the gatehouse, his conclusion was clear. This was an aging fortress with unimpressive defenses, further weakened by years of neglect. Given enough time, even simple siege engines like trebuchets could batter these walls down. But breaching the twins was not the real challenge. It was ensuring that no one escaped. The Freys could easily flee in the opposite direction, and that was the real problem. How could he completely encircle the castle? How could he ensure that not a single Frey slipped away? It was a question that would require further thought. Chapter 58 Considerations. Clay always wore that ring on his finger. A ring adorned with a blood-red gemstone, the symbol of his authority as the commander of the White Sea Guard. His presence in this castle would not go unnoticed by the White Sea Guard operatives hidden within, and the ring served as the most direct insignia of his command. Before his departure, Steward Rivers had given him precise instructions. Upon reaching the twins, if he required the White Sea Guard's support, he needed only to carve the symbol of a trident onto the outer wall of the fortress's largest sept. Upon seeing this mark, the operatives of the White Sea Guard within twins would find a way to make contact with him. The secret phrase for identification was the short phrase, Black Sea, White Waves. The process seemed simple, but verifying identities in such matters was always a delicate task. A degree of secrecy and counterfeiting prevention was necessary. However, if the verification process was too complex, it would make the entire chain fragile, drastically reducing its practicality. Before coming to the twins, Clay had only intended for the operatives to observe the internal affairs of House Frey. He had yet to decide on their next course of action. But after these 2 days in the twins, through what he had personally witnessed, the scattered pieces of information he had gathered from the guards, and, most notably, the conversation he had just had with Aenys Frey, Clay could now say with certainty that the entire House Frey was sitting atop a volcano, one that could erupt at any moment. Lord Walder Frey was too dominant, having controlled every aspect of his family's power for decades. Now, at 90 years old, he showed no obvious signs of weakness or decline in energy. This old man, whose age was 5 or 6 times that of Clay's, had taken an 8th wife on the day of his 90th birthday, Joyce Ehrenford, a girl of just 16, about the same age as Clay himself. The king was strong-willed and long-lived. Though he aged with each passing day, there was no sign that he would relinquish his power anytime soon. Meanwhile, his crown prince, Stevrin, and the numerous other princes of House Frey had long since grown impatient. They eagerly awaited the day the old man would return to the embrace of the 7 gods. At the same time, they schemed and competed against one another by any means necessary, each vying for the old lord's favor, willing to do anything to win his approval. Aenys Frey's words today contained a great deal of deception, but it was not without an underlying motive. It was evident that he sought to win over House Manderly and bring them in as allies. The laws of inheritance were supreme, but in the face of absolute noble power, sometimes those laws could become rather flexible. As Clay made his way toward the northern wall, he mulled over the situation. The southern wall was indeed a weak point, but not weak enough to be easily exploited. The towers stood in close formation, and while the bricks were blanketed in moss, there were no visible cracks that could threaten the structure's integrity. His captain of the guard followed closely at his side. Clay spoke in a low voice, his words just loud enough for the man beside him to hear. If you had 4,000 men under your command, how would you take the twins? The captain stiffened in shock, immediately glancing around to check their surroundings. Aside from the many White Harbor guards trailing behind them, the section of the wall they stood on was deserted. Only then did he allow himself to relax slightly. Now, he understood, his young lord had long been contemplating this question. He had deliberately chosen an isolated spot to voice it. To be openly discussing how to capture the twins while standing on House Frey's land. Only someone like young Lord Clay, who had the audacity to kill a Lannister, would dare pose such a question. The thought flashed through the captain's mind. At first, he assumed the young lord was merely jesting. But when he stole a glance at Clay's expression, devoid of any trace of humor, he realized his lord was completely serious. My lord, with 4,000 men, if it were me, I don't believe I could take the twins. Lord Walder Frey can muster over 3,000 troops. If it comes to a siege, with our forces at nearly equal numbers, there would be little chance of victory. Though he answered honestly, as a seasoned warrior, this question was not difficult for him to consider. Yet, as he observed his young lord silently contemplating, waves of shock continued to surge through his mind. What exactly was his young lord planning to do on this trip to the twins? As the captain personally chosen by Lord Wyman Manderly to protect Clay, he held a respected position within the White Harbor Guard. Naturally, he was aware that Clay had originally come to the twins to pay a courtesy visit to Lord Walder Frey and to discuss his marriage arrangement. But now, a chilling realization settled over him. Clay had never cared about the marriage. From the very beginning, his interest had never been in any Frey woman. His true focus was on House Frey itself. Or rather, the twins. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Clay threw another question at him. I am aware that House Frey only has about 500 standing soldiers. The 3,000 men you mentioned, does that mean the remaining 2,500 are temporary levies? Peasant soldiers. Yes, my lord. Then let me ask you this. If the conditions were right, would it not be possible to station just 1,000 men outside the city gates and prevent Lord Frey's 2,500 peasant soldiers from entering the city at all? In theory, yes. But, my lord, the twins has 2 gates. At best, we could block the eastern gate, but the western gate, from what I know, most of the major Frey estates are on the eastern bank. The western side is closer to the mountains and is not heavily populated. That is true, my lord. Though Clay's ideas seemed far-fetched, the captain had to admit that, Under the right circumstances, it could work. The riverlands were densely populated, yet apart from Riverrun, the seat of Lord Tully, no single noble house maintained a standing army of more than 1,000 men. When war broke out, lords relied on their vassal knights to raise peasant soldiers from their estates, gather them, equip them, and then march to battle. But that process took time. If an enemy force struck before they could properly muster their troops, they could cripple the bulk of their military strength before the battle even began. Regardless of why his young lord had such dangerous thoughts, as a veteran soldier, the captain knew one thing. When war erupted, nobles would always call their forces into their castles or rally them at a designated location. For Clay's plan to succeed, they would need to strike before House Frey could mobilize its levies. Their army would have to remain hidden in the forests east of the castle, launch an unexpected attack, and have their cavalry rush in to seize control of the gate. The problem was, House Frey wasn't foolish. They surely had scouts stationed throughout the region. Keeping their army's arrival completely hidden would be nearly impossible. My lord, for this plan to work, we would have to eliminate every scout House Frey has hidden in the eastern forests. Otherwise, the moment our forces approached, they would be discovered. Clay chuckled. That is not your concern. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and handed it to the puzzled captain. His tone turned grave. Take this symbol. Choose someone among the guards whom you trust absolutely and have them carve it onto the outer wall of the sept. You must not do it yourself. Find someone reliable, someone inconspicuous. There must be no mistakes. Now, he would see what the White Sea Guard's hidden operatives in the Twins had learned. Chapter 59 Frontstage and backstage. These matters could not be handled personally by Clay, who was at the center of attention. Too many eyes were watching him, and the captain of his guard, who had been following him closely, was also unsuitable for such a task. Among the 200 members of the White Harbor Guard who had arrived in the Twins, the least conspicuous individual was the best choice for this mission. These individuals had no knowledge of the true purpose behind carving a trident symbol on the outer wall of the sept. Even if they were captured and interrogated, they would have nothing meaningful to reveal, because they genuinely didn't know. Now that Clay had stepped onto southern soil, the old gods held no sway here. This meant the three-eyed raven's ever-watchful gaze had lost its power in this region. For now, Clay no longer needed to worry about secrets being exposed. As for the north, well, Clay couldn't yet prevent the three-eyed raven from prying into his affairs. However, the creature wouldn't dare take action against him, not with Bran and the heart trees acting as its Achilles heel. Taking the ordinary-looking sheet of paper handed to him, the captain of the guard immediately recognized it as nothing more than common stationery. Unfolding it, his eyes landed on the distinctive trident symbol drawn at its center. The captain stared at it in confusion, unable to comprehend what his young lord was trying to accomplish. Did this have something to do with a special prayer ritual for the Seven? After all, House Manderly also worshipped the Seven. Clay ignored the puzzled look. He trusted that his guards wouldn't need him to repeat his instructions. He knew they would complete the task. Having circled the castle walls, Clay found that the northern and southern walls were in much the same condition. Dampness clung to every brick, but there were no major weaknesses to exploit. This meant Clay couldn't identify a weak spot for a focused assault. He would have to devise another plan. Descending from the walls near the castle gate, Clay squinted up at the sun, now climbing high into the sky. He silently prayed that this midday meal wouldn't involve yet another unwanted encounter with a Frey. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as Clay prepared to leave, he was stopped in his tracks by the distinctive raspy voice of Ser Stevran Frey. Clay, my father invites you to join him for lunch. I trust you'll accept, won't you? For a brief moment, Clay was caught off guard. Walder Frey. What could that old schemer possibly want now? But his expression shifted swiftly, and a polite smile graced his face. Cursing silently to himself, Clay had no choice but to comply. After a brief moment of thought, he had a fair guess as to what this invitation was really about. Sharing a meal was secondary. What Walder Frey truly wanted was to interrogate him. For the third time, Clay stepped into the great hall of the Twins' main keep. The mess left from the previous night's feast had been thoroughly cleaned, leaving no trace of the chaotic revelry. Only the faint scent of wine lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of the previous night's excesses. A long table, roughly 6 or 7 meters in length, had been set up at the center of the hall, covered in rich and hearty dishes meant to fortify the body against the chill of the riverlands. Walder Frey himself sat at the table's head, hunched in his chair as he focused intently on carving into a roasted suckling pig, its golden brown skin crackling under his knife. Strangely, Clay noticed that no women were present. For a man like Walder Frey, who was rarely seen without a woman draped over him, this was highly unusual. Only 2 chairs had been set out in the hall. One was for Walder Frey, and the other naturally belonged to Clay. As Walder's heir, Esser Stevran had not been offered a seat. Instead, the old knight quietly grabbed a plump chicken leg from the table, gave his father a brief nod in greeting, and slipped out of the hall, thoughtfully closing the door behind him. Since he was already here, Clay didn't hesitate. He took his seat, letting his gaze wander across the table as he sought out dishes that suited his tastes. Poison wasn't a concern. Ordinary toxins wouldn't affect him. His body could neutralize them with ease. As for something as potent as the tears of Lee, Walder Frey might not even have access to such a rare poison, and even if he did, there was no reason to waste it on Clay. Help yourself, Manderly boy, Walder Frey muttered. An old man like me can't eat much anymore. Clay glanced up briefly, then smiled as if he believed the gesture was sincere. Without a word, he casually selected some of his favorite foods and began to eat. The wine was particularly excellent, a rich, golden vintage from Arbor. A full bottle sat beside Clay's hand, and he poured himself a generous glass. Slowly savoring the wine's flavor, Clay silently wondered how long Walder Frey would hold back before speaking his mind. The meal stretched on for about half an hour. Both men ate slowly, Clay out of habit, and Walder Frey because age had weakened his jaw, forcing him to chew with deliberate care. Finally, Walder Frey set down his wine cup, exhaled in satisfaction, and turned his calculating gaze toward Clay. His wrinkled face twisted into something that resembled a smile, though it lacked any warmth. Well now, Manderly boy, Walder began, his voice laced with suspicion, it seems you've been quite popular with some of my more foolish kin these past few days. Clay understood what he was implying. Keeping his expression calm, he shrugged indifferently and replied in a steady tone, indeed. I'm grateful to House Frey for their warm hospitality. They've certainly been enthusiastic. Walder Frey gave a derisive snort, exhaling sharply through his nose as though Clay's nonchalant response amused him. Word has it, Walder said, narrowing his eyes, that my great-granddaughter Valda tried to climb into your bed, yet somehow failed. Any idea how that happened? As he spoke, Walder's narrow eyes widened, fixating on Clay with sharp intensity, studying every flicker of movement or change in expression. But Walder would be disappointed. Clay's face remained calm, as smooth and still as the surface of the God's Eye Lake. With measured patience, Clay replied evenly, Lord Frey, I know nothing about what Valda attempted. I believe House Frey has always maintained a strict and respectable family discipline. Surely, this must be nothing more than gossip. Clay had nearly added a sarcastic remark about how no descendant of such a wise and virtuous elder would ever stoop to such behavior, but wisely held his tongue. It wasn't the time to provoke this old schemer. Walder Frey squinted at Clay's face for a few seconds longer before finally sighing and nodding. You're right, Manderly boy, Walder muttered coldly. This must be nothing but idle rumors. Seems I'll have to remind some folks to keep their tongues in check. Clay offered a polite smile, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Having gotten nothing useful from that exchange, Walder shifted topics. His blue-gray eyes glinted with a peculiar sharpness as he asked, Well then, Manderly boy, can you tell me what you and my foolish third son were discussing this morning at the eastern wall? I've been told he was waiting there just for you. This was true. Apart from Clay's White Sea Guards, there had also been several Frey soldiers loyal to Lord Walder Frey himself. Denying the meeting would be pointless. Clay didn't know whether Aenys Frey had already spilled the details to his father, but it hardly mattered. Clay knew exactly what to say. Chapter 60 The meeting Clay didn't answer Lord Frey's question directly. Instead, he responded with a question of his own. Lord Frey, would you prefer to hear the truth or a lie? The old lord, his face appearing even more gaunt under the dim flickering candlelight, narrowed his eyes. The sagging skin on his face twitched slightly as he replied with a flat expression. Don't play games with me, Manderly boy. I know how to tell when someone's lying, and as for the truth, Well, I'd like to hear both and decide for myself. Clay chuckled softly, leaning back into his chair. He adjusted his posture until he found a comfortable position and began to speak slowly. The lie is that I've been discussing with Esser Aines how to help him replace his older brother, Esser Stevran, as your successor. The truth is, he wants my sister to marry his grandson. In reality, both statements were true. But by presenting them this way, one is a lie and one is the truth, Clay ensured that his listener would instinctively focus on only one. After all, no matter how desperate Esser Aines might be, he wouldn't openly conspire against his brother with an outsider like Clay. So, naturally, the truth had to be the matter of the marriage proposal. As for the rest, if there were any hidden schemes, they could conveniently be ignored. Hey, so how did you respond to that foolish third son of mine? Lord Walder fell silent for a moment, his narrowed eyes glinting with calculation. Ultimately, he chose to believe the truth. In his mind, his third son was a cautious man, one who wouldn't dare voice such treasonous ambitions to an outsider like Clay. I refused him, Clay answered bluntly. His tone was firm, devoid of pretense. To be honest, Esser A's request came too suddenly. I didn't even know who they were, and frankly speaking. Clay paused, allowing his words to linger for effect. Lord Frey, your family has plenty of young men. Why wouldn't I choose a better match for my sister? In front of Lord Walder Frey, Clay saw no need for the polite excuses he had offered Esser Aines. He spoke directly, not out of arrogance, but because he knew it was pointless to dance around the truth with a man like Walder Frey. Once those words were out, Clay knew the so-called lunch was now effectively over. Lord Walder's true intention in inviting him had never been to ask about trivial details. It was to assert control, like an aging spider showing that his web was still firmly under his command. The details themselves were secondary. Clay's answer hadn't strayed from what Lord Frey had expected, so with no surprises to address, the meal had reached its natural conclusion. Nodding slightly, Lord Walder's voice rasped, sounding as rough as dried bark. Good. A union between families is no small matter, and it shouldn't be rushed. Since you're thinking along those lines, I'll send a few of my more presentable children to White Harbor. Whether anything comes of it will depend on their own abilities. In truth, Lord Walder cared only for Clay's final statement. More than anything, he wanted Frey blood to intertwine with Manderly blood, a calculated move to expand his family's influence. Clay accepted the offer without a second thought. Refusing would have been pointless. Once those Frey children arrived in White Harbor, he could always turn them away later. In fact, if Clay played his cards right, he might even manipulate the situation to his advantage. Drawing a few key members of Stevran's direct line into White Harbor could give him leverage, hostages, of sorts, in the event of war. And if that failed, well, turning some unfortunate Freys into the infamous Frey pies might just be an amusing alternative. Knowing Lord Walder's love for his numerous offspring, such a gift from House Manderly would surely leave an impression. Now, all Clay had to do was wait. Wait for the White Sea Guard agents lurking in the area to make contact. Go, Clay ordered, his gaze flicking toward the entrance. Get rid of that Frey standing outside, he's an eyesore. The captain gave a curt nod, flexed his fingers as if limbering up for a fight, and turned to leave. But before he could step away, Clay called him back. Wait. His voice dropped lower, quieter, enough to ensure only the captain could hear. After you clear the entrance, have someone keep watch by the door. If anyone arrives and shows you the symbol I had you carved this afternoon, confirm the passphrase. If everything checks out, invite them in, but make it seem like they're an old acquaintance. Understand? The captain frowned briefly, then nodded again. He might not have been the sharpest blade in the armory, but even he knew now, that symbol wasn't part of some religious ceremony. It was a signal. Clay wasn't particularly concerned about loose tongues. The trident symbol they had carved held a crucial detail, a subtle directional marker that changed with each set timeframe. Each period had its own designated direction, ensuring only those aware of the correct symbol for that specific moment would recognize it. Anyone attempting to mimic the mark at the wrong time would unknowingly trigger an alert. To the trained eyes of the White Sea Guard, that misplaced symbol would be an unmistakable warning, a clear sign that someone had leaked information. And if that happened, Clay knew exactly what the White Sea Guard's response would be. disengage, disappear, and leave no trace behind. The next morning arrived, and after finishing breakfast, Clay found himself practicing the wolf school swordsmanship technique in the courtyard. As he settled into the rhythm of his training, Clay suddenly realized just how dull Westerosi entertainment truly was. Leisure activities seemed to revolve around two things: alcohol and violence. Drinking, brawling, wrestling, sparring, these seemed to be the primary forms of amusement. Even the Ironborn had their own twisted pastime, a blood-soaked spectacle they called the finger dance. And the evenings, well, they all ended the same way. Whether in bed, sprawled across rugs, draped over balconies, or tangled together out in the woods, the sounds were unmistakable, loud, relentless, and impossible to ignore. With his sharp hearing, Clay had grown painfully accustomed to those wretched noises. Out of sheer boredom, Clay had once taught the captain of the guard how to play 5 in a row. After easily winning 2 rounds, Clay quickly lost interest, but the captain was hooked. Soon enough, he'd introduced the game to the rest of the guards. With parchment scarce, the men resorted to scratching grids into the dirt using daggers and twigs. By midday, the courtyard resembled a battlefield of circles and crosses. Groups of guards huddled together, muttering strategies and celebrating victories. Clay couldn't help but feel his eye twitch. He could already picture the Frey servants arriving later, staring blankly at the chaotic mess of symbols etched across the courtyard, scratching their heads in confusion as they tried to decipher what the strange markings meant. That was when Clay began reminiscing about Gwent, a game that once brought him so much joy. A game so satisfying it had earned the nickname, The Witcher's True Calling. His mind wandered, imagining himself and Winifred engaged in a heated match. Clay would play Robb Stark, triggering the effect that summoned Grey Wind. Then Winifred would counter by playing Wildfire, instantly incinerating Grey Wind and scorching both their front lines. Wait. The more Clay thought about it, the more the idea seemed possible. Westeros practically had its own ready-made factions. Stark, Tully, Arryn, Lannister, Baratheon, Martell, Tyrell, and Greyjoy. He could even add Targaryen and the Night's Watch. Great lords could serve as leader cards, while direwolves, dragons, shadowcats, and other beasts could act as summonable units. There could be siege engines, wildfire traps, and more. Clay grinned to himself, unable to stop the absurd thought that followed. 2 armies poised for battle, soldiers tense, weapons drawn, only for the opposing commanders to lock eyes across the field. Oh, isn't that my old card game rival? Indeed. The battle can wait. Let's settle this with a game of cards. A smile tugged at the corner of Clay's lips. He wasn't sure how long he'd been daydreaming when his guard captain's voice snapped him back to reality. Young master, the captain reported, the contact has arrived. The mark and passphrase matched perfectly. Clay blinked, pushing aside his wandering thoughts. His gaze shifted to the figure standing nearby. A short, wiry man dressed like a traveling merchant. Without a word, Clay reached into his cloak and extended his hand, revealing the ring that marked his authority as commander of the White Sea Guard. The moment the merchant caught sight of the ring, he immediately dropped to one knee. Auntie Rivers of the Twins, he introduced himself, his voice steady. At your service, Commander.